the market.
Speaker, the Chancellor knows very well that Huddersfield in the Leeds City region is a hotspot for new technology and innovation and a tech centre. But many of the people in Huddersfield and Leeds are really demoralised by the future of leaving the European Union. What can he do to give them some hope that there's a future for their businesses and their universities?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm well aware that Huddersfield, like Chelmsford, is a leading centre of industry and technology development. And actually, our many towns and cities that have traditionally been centres of manufacturing are changing very fast in response to the changing nature of manufacturing industry. What I can say to the honourable gentleman is that I will be making a spring statement to the House next week in the context of some very important decisions that the House will be making about our exit from the European Union, and I will be setting out my vision for Britain's future.
Mr. Speaker, renewables is a key future technology sector. Can the Chancellor assure the House that the offshore sector growth will not be limited by government airspace protection rules, or, if it will the government look to invest instead in onshore wind?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable lady is talking about radar interference problems with wind turbines, something I remember from my Ministry of Defence days. And the Treasury and BIS will always argue robustly for protecting the economic potential of these technologies. But of course we have to look at our national security interests as well and get the balance right.
Chris Leslie.
Speaker, how on earth do people think that we're going to be improving the UK's new technology position when we're on the brink in this House of committing to a disastrous Brexit that will undermine our research funding, stifle our skilled migration, will hobble in some ways some of the developments in our pharmaceuticals and biotech sector, wave goodbye to the European Medicines Agency? Isn't the truth that actually our task is going to be to prevent a deterioration in our future prospects as a country if we go down that particular route?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I understand the honourable gentleman's point, and I know he speaks very sincerely and from the heart on these matters. But my view is that we have a huge amount of pent-up investment that has not gone ahead over the last 2.5 years because of uncertainty. Once we can provide clarity to British business about our future, and we do that by supporting the deal that my right honourable friend the Prime Minister will be bringing forward next week, we will unleash that investment and we will allow Britain to achieve its rightful potential as one of the world's leading technology powers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. New technologies enabling us to work from anywhere and at any time are bringing an end to the traditional rapidly declining 9 to 5. In order to make the most of this, we need to harness such advantage to work smarter rather than just harder. How is the Treasury investing in enabling people to become more productive and work more flexibly?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I started work in 1977, and I'm not sure I ever remember that traditional 9 to 5. But the government is helping people to be more productive and work flexibly by committing over £1 billion of public money to next-generation digital infrastructure, including full fibre broadband and 5G. Obviously, the primary investment will come from the private sector, but the public investment ensures that those parts of the country that wouldn't otherwise be served because they're not commercial can share in this important technology. And we're supporting workplace productivity in other ways, including by investing £56 million to help small businesses develop leadership and management skills in partnership with the Be the Business programme.
Yes.
I'm sorry, but when it comes to funding the new technologies that really matter, this government, especially the Treasury, has been abysmal. The climate crisis is upon us now. This government's reaction: carbon capture and storage, support funding axed. Tidal technologies of which we were poised to be a world leader, Swansea Lagoon, cancelled. Innovative emerging storage technologies now being slapped with business rates. All at the same time, you're throwing billions into new tax breaks for oil and gas. Does he agree this government isn't facing the climate emergency, it's creating it?
Chancellor.
No, Mr. Speaker. We're committing additional funding, as I've already set out, to innovation, to research and development. The Faraday Battery Challenge is a good example. Lots of that money going into the technologies that will underpin the decarbonisation of our economy in the future. But we've got to get the balance right here. Consumers of energy in this country do not want to see bills rising because we've made imprudent decisions. We have to do this in a way that takes public opinion with us to decarbonise our energy sector, decarbonise homes and decarbonise industry in a sustainable way.
Chris Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What's my right friend doing to make sure that small and medium-sized business in the northwest of England are at the forefront of our ongoing technological revolution?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I recently visited the northwest and saw at first hand the enterprising and enthusiastic spirit of SMEs in the region. So I'm happy to confirm that at the 2018 budget I backed locally led innovation by doubling the Strength in Places Fund to £235 million, and I also committed an additional £5 million to encourage proposals for new university enterprise zones following a successful pilot scheme which invested £15 million in Liverpool. The Made Smarter pilot in the northwest is helping manufacturers to adopt digital technologies, and together these measures will ensure that businesses in the northwest can take the lead in the fourth industrial revolution.
David Linden.
Number 4.
Mr. Speaker, the Low Pay Commission recommends minimum wages for the under-25s, such that they're as high as possible while maintaining those young people's employment prospects. And we've seen a 45% reduction in youth unemployment since 2010 as a result.
David Linden.
Lovely, but that's not actually the answer to the question I asked, which was simply, was there an economic impact assessment carried out? And clearly the answer to that is no. So the government clearly has an ideological problem with a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. Now, given that we are doing national apprenticeship this week, does she think it's really acceptable to pay apprentices just £3.70 an hour in this country under UK law? And will she use the Spring Statement to take action for a fair day's pay for a fair day's work? And if she won't, will she devolve this to Scotland and we'll do the job for her?
The reality is that the reason we have been so successful in reducing youth unemployment, which was almost double what it is in 2010, is because we've taken a reasonable strategy with minimum wages. We've also had a welfare to work programme, and we've helped young people get those experience and skills. It'd be completely wrong to raise wages to the extent where people were unemployed and those young people weren't able to get the experience and skills they needed to succeed in life.
Question 5, Mr. Speaker.
Financial Secretary and Paymaster
The government's
Stride.
analysis indicates that leaving the EU without a deal would not be good for the UK economy, which is why we are so determined as a government to secure an appropriate deal with the European Union that can pass through this House.
Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 4,000 jobs in Merthyr Tydfil and Rymru in the manufacturing sector. This government has had 2 years to negotiate a good deal for that sector, but have so far failed. So would the Minister share my concern that Nissan's decision to build its X-Trail in Japan and similar decisions by Honda are a sign of things to come as a result of this government's chaotic negotiations?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Executive of Honda has made it perfectly clear that it is not a consequence of Brexit that the decisions have been taken in respect of that particular business. There are other factors across the world affecting car sales, such as the switch away from diesel, and indeed in the case of Honda, the agreement that has been entered into between Japan and the European Union on tariffs, which means that the move to Japan in due course will attract no tariffs as they export into Japan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does not this underline the importance of fine-tuning the deal so that we can jettison the backstop using existing technology under existing EU law and take forward the innovative Malthouse proposals which will ensure that we can move forward and to build the new Britain?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the House has made very clear the basis on which it would be prepared to accept the deal negotiated with the European Union, and that will necessitate some changes to the backstop arrangements. That is what is being negotiated at the moment, and in due course that will come back to this House.
Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Public sector institutions in this country spend £1 billion a year on food, and in the event of a no-deal Brexit, we know that there's been so many warnings that food price inflation will make that unaffordable. What is he doing to protect not just jobs in the food sector, but also those people that depend on the meals?
Well, the Honourable Lady is right to raise an issue which in fact relates to our tariff policy in the event of a no-deal Brexit, and what we have made very clear is that we will carefully balance, on the one hand, making sure that we protect consumers from unwanted price rises, at the same time as using our tariff policy to make sure that we provide appropriate protection to vital elements within the economy.
Antoinette Sandback.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Cheshire-based company ABB have stated that investment in automation could result in radical improvements in cost efficiency, allowing work to move back to the UK. Will my right honourable friend consider incentivising investment in automation through the tax system?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have already brought in some very important measures to do just that, not least increasing the annual investment allowance as announced at the last budget from £200,000 to £1 million. We keep all taxes under review, and I will certainly bear in mind the very important point raised by my honourable friend.
Mr. Speaker, in a recent survey by the Fraser of Allender Institute, 62% of Scottish businesses said they didn't feel ready for Brexit. Will the Chancellor bring forward an emergency budget to provide support for SMEs in order to cope with the Brexit that he's proposing?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has made it clear that in the event that there is a no deal, we will take stock of the situation as it is at that time and take whatever measures are necessary to ensure that we protect and support businesses throughout the United Kingdom.
Blackman.
Specifically talking about the Brexit that the Chancellor is proposing, which is presumably not a no-deal Brexit. In relation to a no-deal Brexit, it looks like 100,000 jobs could be lost in Scotland as a direct result. But in relation to the deal Brexit that the Chancellor is proposing, the Bank of England has said that unemployment could be up to 4% higher by 2023 if the Prime Minister's deal is approved. Does the Chancellor believe that keeping his job is worth costing thousands theirs?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't believe that the figure that the Honourable Lady has referred to is accurate. But what I would say on the whole issue of jobs, that this is the government that has seen employment at a record high, unemployment at the lowest level since 1975, youth unemployment at half the level it was in 2010, unlike, I have to say, the party opposite that saw youth unemployment increase by almost 50%.
Gordon Henderson.
Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, at the budget I announced an extra £420 million for road maintenance, including potholes, and £150 million to ease congestion on local roads. I also announced that from 2020 all road tax will be invested back into our roads network via a National Roads Fund. This will be £28.8 billion between 2020 and 2025, including a record £25.3 billion for our strategic roads. This is part of our plan to upgrade our infrastructure so that it's fit for the future, and another element of our overall public investment, which is set to reach the highest sustained level for 40 years.
Well, I'm grateful for that answer, and I'm also grateful for the continued investment in our roads. But would my right honourable friend understand the frustration felt by my constituents who have seen their area transformed by massive housing developments, but have not seen the improvements in our local roads infrastructure, particularly the A249 and the M2, needed to service those homes?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are making good progress on improving Junction 5 of the M2 and the A249 Stockbury roundabout. This will reduce journey times, make journeys safer and support future housing and employment growth. And all this is in addition to recent investments from the Local Growth Fund in Sittingbourne and Sheppey, opening a new roundabout on the A2500 in December 2018, following a £1.26 million investment, and the £2.5 million funding for the regeneration of Sittingbourne Town Centre.
Dan Jarvis.
Mr. Speaker, funding for road infrastructure is very important, but I wonder if the Chancellor thinks it should sit alongside investment in more active travel, walking and cycling.
Chancellor.
Both, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we want to encourage active travel, cycling and walking, particularly in cities where that is the most appropriate response to dealing with the twin challenges of congestion and air quality. And Sheffield has benefited from funding that will allow it to enhance the offer to walkers and cyclists.
Priti Patel.
Over the last decade, we have seen a 25% increase in the number of enterprises in the fantastic county of Essex. That is despite our crumbling infrastructure and our roads in particular. Can I make an urgent plea to the Chancellor to support and invest in the two economic arteries that go through the heart of Essex and the Whittam constituency, which is the A12 and the A120?
Well, this, I think, probably won't be the first time that the Right Honourable Lady has asked me about these two roads. She's a formidable champion of the transport infrastructure that runs through her constituency, and I congratulate her on that. As I've just announced, we've made a commitment to hypothecating all road tax to the National Roads Fund. That will make a record amount of funding available for road projects in the next period.
Brian.
Road traffic accidents are a major cause of acquired brain injury. So can I urge the Chancellor of the Exchequer to consider setting up a special fund in proportion to the amount that he's talking about for road infrastructure next week, announce it next week if he's still going to do his statement next Wednesday, to make sure that there is a fund available to people in the National Health Service who are developing very innovative new ways of rehabilitating people who've had road traffic accidents. And if he doesn't understand, he can ask the member for Salisbury, who's very good on this.
Well, I'd first of all like to reassure the honourable gentleman that I will be making the spring statement next week and reminding him, and indeed the House, that it is not a fiscal event under the new budget architecture. But what I would say to him is that we have put very significant additional funding into the National Health Service. I note the point that he's making about acquired brain injury and the research that's going on around it, and I will draw the attention of the Health Secretary to his comments.
Well done. Mr. Philip Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor has rightly made big play that we need to improve our productivity in this country, and one of the biggest drags on productivity in my part of the world are clogged up roads. My part of West Yorkshire is one of the most congested parts of the UK. So will the Chancellor use money either from his productivity fund or from his road building fund to make sure that there is enough money in the kitty to progress the long-awaited and much-needed Shipley Eastern bypass?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend will know, we have funded a study into the Shipley bypass, and it's absolutely right that very often the highest value road investments can be relatively modest local schemes which relieve pressure and allow regeneration of towns, release of housing land and the more efficient operation of local industry. But we will have a record-size fund available but through the hypothecation of vehicle excise duty.
Well, the member for Shipley won't stop going on about it until he gets it. I think of that we can be absolutely certain. Mr. Virendra Sharma.
Thank you. Question number 7.
Minister Stride.
Mr. Speaker, the steps we are taking to protect manufacturing in the event of a no deal include supporting the Prime Minister's deal and the negotiations to make sure we have a smooth exit from the European Union, and the Treasury itself has made available in excess of £4 billion by way of contingency funding for departments right across Whitehall.
Thank you for this response from the Minister. Mr. Speaker, last month I surveyed businesses in my constituency of Ealing Southall, and they overwhelmingly said that they want Brexit cancelled. Will the Chancellor stand up for British businesses, end the uncertainty, and use his immense personal prestige in the Cabinet and with the Prime Minister to stop Brexit once and for all?
Chancellor heard the bit about his prestige.
Well, that's well, I think it's just little old me, I'm afraid. But I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that I believe we should respect the results of the June 2016 referendum, a democratic exercise that saw a higher turnout than for any other democratic event in the history of our country. The important thing now, Mr. Speaker, is that we get the right deal for us to leave, which we are working on, and when it comes back to Parliament, I hope that the honourable gentleman will support it.
Christian Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor has recently attended 2 events that I was also present at, organised by major aerospace companies, so he knows how they feel about the terrifying prospects of no deal. Since these are the companies that pay this country's bills, why is he ignoring them?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are most certainly not ignoring those businesses, or indeed businesses from a variety of different sectors up and down the economy. We've been deeply engaged with business, both through the Treasury and BEIS and other departments. And I can assure him from, for example, the issue of just-in-time deliveries and the flow of trade across our borders, that we have done an immense amount of work to prepare for the possibility of a no deal, to make sure that we protect the very companies that he refers to.
Question 8, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, we are acting to tackle single-use plastic waste at source by introducing a world-leading tax on plastic packaging. The tax, which I announced at the budget, will provide a clear economic incentive to business to use recycled plastic, and alongside DEFRA's reform of the packaging producer responsibility system, it will transform the economics of sustainable packaging. The government recently published consultations on the detail of both measures, alongside consultations on consistent waste collection and a potential deposit return scheme for beverage containers. We are determined to be the first government that leaves the environment in a better state than we found it.
Mr. Speaker, I hear the Chancellor, but in setting policy, will he recognise the very positive role that plastic packaging plays in reducing cost to consumers by protecting goods in transit, and in reducing the environmental burden of food waste by keeping food fresher for longer?
The points my honourable friend makes are well made, and of course it's about getting the balance right. The government recognises that plastic packaging can play an important role. But the government wants to reduce the environmental impact of single-use plastic waste and encourage more sustainable forms of plastic packaging that can be recycled. And the packaging tax will encourage businesses to use more recycled plastic in the production of packaging and will therefore drive a more sustainable packaging industry.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My 10-year-old constituent, Emily Haynes, wrote to me about this, and she assured me it wasn't copied and pasted. And in fact, when I wrote back to her by hand, her father emailed me to say he had no idea that his daughter had written to me on this subject. So can I just say to the Chancellor not to listen to those who say that he should in any way dilute what he's doing on single-use plastics, and in fact should do more on single-use plastics, to do, as Emily says, introduce tough new taxes to make sure that we deal with this environmental scourge.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's what we are doing. This will be the world's first plastic tax, and it is carefully designed to go with the grain of the market, to incentivise manufacturers to use more recycled plastic in their packaging, and because of that it creates an effective market for packaging, and together with the producer responsibility note system will transform the way plastic packaging enters the circular economy in this country.
Peter Dowd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased the Chancellor is apparently taking the issue of plastic waste seriously. The government has committed £61.4 million to global research to help plastic waste from entering the oceans. Given the challenge, is this sufficient?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's a good start, and the idea is to identify ways in which we can work with countries around the world, including in many of our overseas territories, which are particularly vulnerable to this issue, to ensure that we develop effective methods of avoiding plastic waste entering the ocean. Of course, the best way to do that is ensure that they're either not created in the first place or that they're effectively recycled. But avoiding dumping at sea is our #1 priority.
Peter Dowd.
Mr. Speaker, talking of preventing waste, the millions wasted on the ferries fiasco, the drone debacle, the Northern Rail mess, the Carillion collapse, economic tagging turmoil, the £2 billion East Coast chaos, and finally £72,000 defending an illegal prisoner book ban. As the custodian of the public finances, isn't it time for the Chancellor to impose a ban on the failing Transport Secretary wasting any more public dosh?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I am not going to take any lectures from anybody on the front bench opposite about waste. This lot are world champion wasters of public money. They've done it before, and given half a chance, they'll do it again.
Raymond Chishti.
Number 9, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister General.
Mr. Speaker, the Government is committed to ensuring that Medway and indeed the whole of Kent have the infrastructure it needs. The South East Local Enterprise Partnership has secured £590 million from 3 rounds of the Local Growth Fund, supporting around 30 important transport schemes in Kent and Medway.
Raymond Chishti.
Council's £170 million housing infrastructure bid will have significant impact in unlocking regeneration in the Thames estuary, providing the extra much-needed homes, jobs and transport connectivity. Can the Minister clarify when such excellent bids will be considered and announced? And by when? Council.
Well, I know that the honourable gentleman has been raising this matter assiduously. At the spring statement in 2018, the Government announced that Medway's Housing Infrastructure Fund was shortlisted for the next stage of assessment. We look forward to receiving the final proposal later this month, which will be considered alongside other HIF bids.
Mike Amesbury.
Question number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Chief Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, at the autumn budget 2018, we gave councils an additional £650 million, which could be spent on adult and children's social care. And since 2017, we've given access to up to £10 billion on dedicated adult social care funding, which means above inflation rises.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 87 people in this country die each day before receiving the care that they need. Does the Minister agree with me that these figures are shameful and that the Chancellor should use the spring statement to tackle this funding crisis in social care?
Well, as I pointed out, social care funding and access to social care funding is increasing beyond inflation. In fact, we have seen improvements in many figures. So, for example, since March 2017, the number of patients who have been delayed leaving hospital due to social care has halved.
Chris Phil.
Question 11, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Glenn.
The Government have worked hard to build a stronger, fairer economy. The economy has grown continuously for the past 9 years. Employment is currently at a record high, and unemployment is currently at the lowest rate since 1975, and real wages are rising.
Well,
it's very welcome that 75% of those new jobs are full-time and only 3% are zero-hours contracts. It's also welcome that the minimum wage has gone up by 38% since 2010. But what assurance can the Minister give that this policy of dramatically increasing the minimum wage to help the poorest in our society will continue?
Minister.
Well, I can confirm also that the national living wage will rise again this year to £8.21. And I can also tell my honourable friend that the Low Pay Commission will be set a new remit for beyond 2020 later this year. We want to be ambitious with the ultimate objective of ending low pay in the UK while protecting employment for lower paid workers.
The Minister, I suspect, knows that it will be more difficult to increase jobs in services businesses if we replace single market membership with a free trade agreement. Would he like to set out for the House what estimate he has made of the scale of difficulty, particularly facing financial services businesses wanting to increase jobs in the current Brexit situation?
What I can say is that financial services are well protected and are ready to engage on arrangements for beyond the implementation period, but the Government is not complacent across the whole of the economy and has a series of interventions through our productivity fund to actually meet the challenges of the next generation.
Jonathan Reynolds.
Mr. Speaker, whenever the Government tables self-congratulatory questions like this, there's a need to put on record what's really happening out there. Minister, 6 million jobs in the UK pay less than the real living wage. 3.8 million people are in insecure employment and 2.5 million people work less than 15 hours a week. Economic growth, where it does exist, is so geographically unequal that it doesn't reflect the reality of what people see around them. So let me ask on behalf of those people, what is this government's strategy for in-work poverty and insecure employment?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. This government's strategy is to relentlessly pursue growth in the economy and opportunities for all. We've seen 18.3% growth since 2010. We see record 32.6 million people in work, and we will continue to prioritise interventions around technical education, cuts in business taxes, support for new technologies to recognise the new jobs that need to be provided for.
Well done. Neil Coyle.
Number 13, please, Mr. Speaker.
A Minister. Minister Glenn.
Thank you. The decision to freeze most working age benefits for 4 years from 2016 to 17 was one of a number of difficult financial decisions that were taken. But to assist claimants who are affected by debt, as part of the 28 budget package, the government announced a reduction in the maximum rate of deduction from UC awards from 40% to 30%, and this change will help 290,000 claimants.
Neil Coyle.
I thank the Minister for the slightly delayed reply. This morning, the Work and Pension Select Committee visited Charles Dickens Primary School in my constituency to talk to parents, children and the teachers about the impact the benefits freeze and other welfare cuts have had on local families, with many pushed into debt, poverty and destitution as a direct result of government policy. Will the government listen to the Select Committee and lift the benefit freeze 1 year early?
Minister.
Well, the government have been very responsive to representations over the last two budgets, and we see 637,000 fewer children in workless households since 2010. We made a number of interventions at the last budget to increase availability of resources of interest-free advance loans to those who need them, and we are listening and continuing to listen to the concerns of the sector.
Julian Sturdy.
Question 14.
Minister Jenrick.
Mr. Speaker, the best way to sustainably drive economic growth is to raise productivity, and that's a priority for this government. We're increasing public investment in economic infrastructure to its highest sustained level in my lifetime, and at the autumn budget we set out further investments supporting business, technical skills and new technologies.
Mr. Speaker, last month the Chief Secretary saw for herself the investment that York-based Pavers Shoes are making to change their productivity. Yet local businesses are concerned about the fact that traffic congestion is causing on local productivity. With that in mind, will my honourable friend assure me that the Treasury is fully behind DfT proposals to fund the dualling of the York Northern Ring Road?
Well, my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, says that she saw some very good leopard print shoes there, and she knows a potential customer for those. And Pavers are a highly successful business. I've seen for myself in India the success that they're having selling shoes. We are committed to increasing transport investment in the north of England, and the Secretary of State for Transport recently announced the dualling of the A1237 York Outer Ring Road as a scheme in development for the major road network funding.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister agree with me that one of the ways you increase productivity is by maintaining grants at the European levels and investment of research and development? Would he not agree with me that's the way to do it? We've got a lot of good universities in this country.
Well, this government's absolutely committed to maintaining research and development. That's why we are going to be investing record levels in research and development. We're also supporting the private sector, for example, by making research and development tax credits more generous so that businesses across the country can collaborate with universities to drive the economy forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that the Ayrshire Growth Deal and others nationally can act as a catalyst for jobs and productivity, and will he do all that he can to support it?
Absolutely. We're very excited about the £100 million Ayrshire Growth Deal, and we'll continue to support that part of Scotland.
Alex Norris.
Number 16, Mr. Speaker.
Financial Secretary.
The government takes a very serious view of those who enable or promote tax avoidance, and we have taken a number of measures to clamp down on them, including fines or penalties of up to £1 million.
Alex Norris.
Mr. Speaker, in 2017, the government introduced the Criminal Finances Act to great fanfare, claiming it was clamping down on the facilitators of tax dodging. Could the Minister please confirm how many prosecutions have been brought for the new offence of failing to prevent tax evasion?
Well, what I can tell the honourable gentleman is that we have taken action against enablers and promoters, and that in terms of criminal activity, the cumulative amount of time in prison that has resulted from those particular actions is in excess of 100 years.
Well done. Stephen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. HMRC has 2,000 fewer staff today than it did on the day of the referendum. Can the Minister explain what impact HMRC cuts have had on the delayed timetable for the implementation of the UK's future customs regime?
Minister Stride.
Mr. Speaker, I'm confident that HMRC will be ready for whatever the outcome, for example, of the EU negotiations are. We've taken on over 4,000 additional staff to make sure that we're ready for that particular element, and we have, of course, invested £2 billion in additional funding since 2010 to make sure that HMRC can operate effectively.
Gerald Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 19.
Chief Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, since 2010, the economy has grown every year, and there are now 3.5 million more people in work.
Gerald Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my honourable friend confirm that under the Conservatives, in addition to a record number of jobs, wages are growing at their fastest rate in over a decade, meaning more people have the security of a regular wage to provide for their families?
You Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend is right, and this hasn't happened by accident. It's because of the decisions this government has made to cut taxes, to reform employment, to reform welfare, rather than the opposition's approach, which is to say business is the enemy and damage our economy.
Order, we're running late, so what I say to the honourable gentleman, the member for Strangford, is if he can manage to ask a one-sentence question with a question mark at the end of it, I'll call him, and if he can't, I won't. It's a deal. No, not 1.5 sentences, one sentence. Mr. Shannon, get in there.
Can the Minister further outline if there would be tax benefits available for small businesses who may not be able to sustain this level of wage increase? One sentence.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. We need to make sure that all businesses succeed, and one of the things we'll be doing in the spending review is looking at business support and making sure it's just as supportive of new entrants and start-ups.
Oh, this one-sentence model could catch on. That would be splendid. Stephen Kinnock.
No chance.
No pressure there at all, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. Number 23, Mr. Speaker.
Don't look quite so surprised, man. It's your question.
May I blend it with topicals number 1?
But you can blurt it out on the question with which we were dealing if you want. Unburden yourself, man.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you for setting the stage for me so well. I'm proud to chair the all-party parliamentary group on post-Brexit funding for nations, regions and local areas. It is absolutely vital that we have a fair settlement for those regions that need it most as we transition from EU funding into post-Brexit funding. Will the Chancellor of the Exchequer or the Minister responsible agree to meet with the APPG to discuss this vitally important issue?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I'd be delighted to meet with him and colleagues to discuss this important issue.
Oh, yeah, I see what he was driving at in relation to topical questions. Yes. Jolly well done. What a prescient fellow. Topical questions, Stephen Kinnock.
Go on, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can't think of another question to ask, so my question has been responded to. Topical number 1.
I know that the honourable gentleman doesn't believe in the hereditary principle, but I don't think those words would ever have come out of the mouth of his dad. I think he should have a go. Just say topical 1, young man.
Thank you very much, sir. Topical number 1.
Well done. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I have a sense that by the time I've responded, inspiration will have struck the honourable gentleman. My principal responsibility, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure economic stability and the continued prosperity of this country. And at this juncture, the best way to achieve that objective is to support a negotiated Brexit, ensuring a smooth and orderly departure from the EU through a transition period to a new relationship which allows our mutual trade to continue to flourish.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the introduction of the minimum wage, only 14 employers have been prosecuted by HMRC for failing to pay the minimum wage. Does the Chancellor agree with me that's a completely unacceptable state of affairs? And what action is he doing to boost the capacity of HMRC to go after those who are not paying the minimum wage?
Well, Mr. Speaker, HMRC does take action against errant employers and is always pleased to receive information of suspected non-compliance and will investigate any such cases. I'm sorry that the honourable gentleman had difficulty thinking of a question. Anticipating this situation, I have at least 4 or 5 potential questions that the honourable gentleman could have asked me, and I'm happy to show them to him afterwards.
Well, colleagues, on a discretionary basis, I'm changing the order. But believe me, I know why I'm changing the order, and there's a compelling reason in this instance for doing so. Tim Lawton.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday's Education Debate in Westminster Hall heard about a national emergency in school funding based on the NAO Office of predictions of £3 billion savings being required in the next year. And I've often gone on about the £2 billion shortfall in children's social care. So will schools and children's social care be at the top of the Chancellor's priority list in the forthcoming comprehensive spending review?
Yeah.
Chief Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we were able to increase the education budget by £1.3 billion last year, which means there have been real terms funding increases per pupil. And we're already the top spenders in the G7 as a proportion of GDP, according to the OECD. But I do recognise we need to make sure that going into the future, our education system is properly supported. I'd be delighted to meet my honourable friend and colleagues to discuss this further.
MacDonald.
When the Conservatives lost their majority at the last election, the Chancellor conjured up a £1 billion bung to the DUP to buy the Tories back into office. Yesterday, with the announcement of the Towns Fund, we reached a new low in politics in this country, with the attempt by the government to purchase the votes of Labour MPs to vote for the Brexit deal. Mr. Speaker, pork barrel politics has become the new norm under this government.
Absolutely right.
So can I ask the Chancellor, if the price of a DUP vote has been £100 million each, how much has he calculated a Labour MP's vote will cost?
Minister General.
The government has been investing in our cities across the country with interventions such as the Transforming Cities Fund, a £2.5 billion investment. We believe it is important to mirror those investments to drive productivity and economic growth in our towns. And this week we've announced a £1.6 billion intervention to support those towns, which builds on other interventions that we've made throughout the course of the last 12 months, including the Future High Streets Fund.
I can understand why the Chancellor has broken convention today and not responding, because I think he would be ashamed of responding. Because let me tell them what the answer is. If the DUP is worth £100 million, what Labour MPs were offered yesterday was £6 million. But let me ask the Chancellor to undertake another calculation. 7 days ago, he was forced to publish the government's assessment again of a no-deal Brexit. How much it would cost this country. And it was in today's prices nearly £200 billion. How much of a threatened cost to this country will it take this Chancellor to find a backbone to stand up to the Prime Minister and the ERG to prevent a no deal or a bad deal? Or is the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions the only Cabinet Minister willing to put country before career?
Dear, oh dear. Mr. Speaker, as the right honourable gentleman knows very well, I have been working tirelessly to ensure that we avoid a no-deal exit. that we leave the European Union in a smooth and orderly fashion to a new negotiated partnership that allows our complex and important trade relationships to continue to flourish in the future. That is what I spend every working day doing.
Got man.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor briefly made mention of the spring statement, but can he update the House as to his plans for the spring statement on the 13th of March?
Chancellor.
As my honourable friend is aware, because I've said it already this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, the spring statement is not a fiscal event, but I will update the House on the Office for Budget Responsibilities forecast for the UK economy and for the public finances. I will follow the approach that I took at Spring Statement 2018 and also provide the House with an update on progress since the 2018 budget and set out our intended direction for announcements later in the year. And although I've said to my honourable friend that this is not a fiscal event, I can already anticipate him beating a path to my door before the budget in the autumn.
Just hold on. Bambus charalambus.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Schools in my constituency are facing severe budget pressures running into millions. By 2021, some schools will not be able to afford any teaching assistants, learning support assistants, office staff or site staff. Does the Chancellor realise the perilous state of schools' finances, and will he announce adequate funding for schools in his spring statement next week?
Well, as the Chancellor already said, the spring statement is not a fiscal event, and we are increasing school funding by real terms per pupil. But of course, we need to make sure that we're investing properly in our education system. We are conducting a look at human capital, what will be the most important investments, and we will be reporting on that at the spending review.
Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Taking into account the vital work done by East Coast College and Lowestoft Sixth Form College in promoting social mobility and improving the UK's productivity, will my right honourable friend take full account of the letter sent on behalf of 164 colleagues from across the House and increase further education funding, ideally at next week's spring statement, but if not, at the forthcoming spending review?
Well, FE spending is a priority, and we have indeed protected the base rate of funding between 2015 and 2020. I was grateful to receive that letter from colleagues, and I've organised a meeting on the 19th of March. I'm not sure if we'll be able to fit 164 people in a room, but I do hope my honourable friend will be able to attend.
Tom Bray.
Would the Chancellor agree that the £1.6 billion set aside for towns is a pale imitation of the Regional Growth Fund set up under the Coalition? And would he therefore look at establishing a Brexit redundancy fund of up to £7.5 billion to help the 750,000 people who be estimated to lose their jobs in a no-deal scenario?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've told the House many times before, and I will elaborate more at the spring statement next week, in the what I now think unlikely event of a no-deal exit, the government has both fiscal and monetary tools available to it to support the economy. But of course, the likely shock would be on the supply side of the economy, and we would have to be careful in fiscal interventions that were made, that they didn't merely stimulate inflation. So if we were to find ourselves in that situation, we have the firepower and we have the clear intent to intervene to support the economy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure all on the Treasury benches will agree that it's a really important responsibility of government to ensure that our children and our young people can achieve their full potential. With this in mind, can my right honourable friend ensure me that skills and education funding will receive the priority attention they deserve in the upcoming spending round?
Chief Secretary.
My honourable friend is right, and we also need to make sure that we're spending money on the right things. So, for example, the changes this government have made to phonics have seen our children go from some of the poorest readers in Europe to some of the best readers in Europe. So, yes, it's about money, but it's also about what you do with that money.
Dan Jarvis.
Given the urgent need for clarity on post-Brexit regional funding,
When does the government intend to launch the consultation on the UK Shared Prosperity Fund?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we regard the UK Shared Prosperity Fund as very important, and we will launch a consultation this year on the plans for the fund.
Charlie Elphick.
Can the Chancellor tell the House how many people in my Dover and Deal constituency since 2010 are either paying no income tax whatsoever, thanks to government policies, or have seen an income tax cut? And while he's about it, could he put it in a spreadsheet for every single constituency so that the whole House will be able to see what has been done?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that question. It's not possible, Mr. Speaker, to provide an estimate down at constituency level as to the impacts of the changes in the personal allowance, but I can inform my honourable friend that no less than 234,000 individuals have been taken out of income tax altogether who are living in the South East, which includes, obviously, Dover.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Chancellor agree with his right honourable friend, the Environment Secretary, who's told me on a number of occasions now that he believes that other European countries are looking enviously at the United Kingdom's withdrawal deal, especially in the context of all the economic analysis the Treasury's carried out about Brexit scenarios?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not in a position to comment on private conversations that the honourable gentleman may have had with my right honourable friend, the Environment Secretary, but I can tell him that I agree with everything that my right honourable friend has said at this dispatch box.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What assessments has the Treasury made of the impact of air passenger duty on regional and short-haul airlines?
Minister.
Well, air passenger duty is a per-passenger levy paid by all airlines, so there's no reason to believe that it discriminates against smaller airlines. We have chosen to freeze APD on short-haul flights now for 8 years and to take children out altogether. The party opposite, of course, want to hike it with their holiday tax.
Laura Smith.
Mr. Speaker, what is the Chancellor doing to make sure local authorities have sufficient funding to allow care providers to pay sleep-in shifts at a national living wage rate?
Chief Secretary.
Well, we're currently working on this with the Department of Health.
Nicky Morgan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Treasury Select Committee will today publish the Economic Secretary's letter to me from the 30th of January on the current solution to the problems faced by mortgage prisoners. This solution requires the private sector to be receptive to providing new mortgages to those mortgage prisoners currently trapped with inactive lenders. What update can ministers provide on the promised Treasury officials' work with those lenders?
Well, I can tell my right honourable friend that I am in conversations with the FCA about their move to a relative rather than an absolute test. I note that there are a range of views out there about how this problem can be dealt with. The FCA have said that they will come back later this spring with their response, and I'm happy to meet with my right honourable friend to discuss her concerns further.
Ellen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, the Financial Times entitled their editorial, UK territories need to embrace transparency, prompted by the government's decision to pull a vote they knew they were going to lose last night. Does the Chancellor of the Exchequer not feel that he's completely out of kilter with the spirit of the modern age?
What happened, there were some amendments tabled on Thursday, and I think given the constitutional implications of those amendments, it's right that the government works cross departments with the Ministry of Justice and the Foreign Office with dialogue with the Crown Dependencies and Overseas Territories to resolve the matter as the amendment suggested.
Esther McVeigh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Adding to the calls of colleagues, will the Chancellor ensure that more money is provided for schools across the country that desperately need it, and particularly in Cheshire, where it's the lowest funded?
Chief Secretary.
Well, one of the things we have done in response to my honourable friend is introduced a national funding formula to make sure schools' funding is more fair across the country, and it is getting fairer every year. But I'd be delighted to meet her and other colleagues.
Mr. Bailey.
The Chancellor has claimed that the best way to protect public finances from a decline in the motor industry post-Brexit is to back the PM's deal. The Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders says the best way is for the Prime Minister to abandon her red lines and be part of a custom union. Who's right?
Chancellor.
As the Prime Minister has explained to the House many times, the deal that we've negotiated with the European Union provides for most of the benefits of a customs union while still enabling the United Kingdom in certain circumstances to be able to strike trade deals with third countries. That is a win-win outcome, and the House should get behind it.
Is it the intention that we'll be publishing our draft tariff schedule in the event of no deal before the meaningful vote?
I can't give my honourable friend a clear answer in terms of a specific date, but as soon as we are in a position to publish the tariff schedule, we will do so.
John Cryer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Personal debt is now higher than it's ever been in British history. Household debt is now higher than it's ever been, and has increased by nearly £1,000 in the last year alone. How sustainable is that?
That's why the government is very concerned to see that the establishment of the single financial guidance body happens quickly this year. £56 million is spent on debt advice to 530,000 people. It's an area that I take very seriously, and I'll be going to the Credit Union Conference on Saturday to outline some more policy initiatives.
Order. As is normally the case, demand exceeds supply, so I'm sorry to disappoint remaining colleagues, but we're well out of time and we must now move on. Yes, point of order, Dr Sarah Wollaston.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My honourable friend, the member for Liverpool Wavertree, is currently on maternity leave. She has served with great distinction as a member of the Health and Social Care Select Committee and as a spokesperson nationally recognised for her work on mental health. I am deeply concerned to hear that the Labour Party have been seeking names to replace her and oust her from her position on the Select Committee. Surely this is unacceptable and sends entirely the wrong message about how we value maternity leave in this place, and I'm very relieved that none of her colleagues, her former colleagues, were prepared to be nominated in that way. But could I seek your guidance on this point, but also on the wider point that surely Select Committees are at their best when members are able to leave their narrow party politics at the door rather than be a tool of the whip's offices.
Grateful to the honourable lady for a point of order. Yes, OK, if it is, as I believe it to be, on the same matter, I'll hear the honourable lady for Enfield North, and then I will respond to the two of them.
Mr Speaker, and further to that point of order, can I support the point raised by my honourable friend, Chair of the Select Committee, Health Select Committee? Members of this House have previously left their parties and become independent or changed parties. And I understand from the House of Commons Library that they have remained on select committees, only coming off those committees if they expressed a wish to do so. That is clearly not the case here. Can I seek your ruling on the fact that there is no precedent for political parties seeking to remove members who the House has said should remain on their select committees for the duration of the Parliament? Thank you.
I'm grateful to the honourable lady, the member for Totnes, and to the right honourable lady, the member for Enfield North, for those points of order. Just on the very last point, and this isn't in any sense criticism, but from my recollection, there are precedents. The truth of the matter is there are precedents for a lot of things in this place. It doesn't necessarily mean that such a course of action is right, and I say that without prejudice to what colleagues might judge to be the merits of the right honourable lady's point of order as a whole. She has flagged up a very important issue. However, those points of order were raised, at least in part, to elicit a response. I'm grateful to both of them for giving me notice of their points of order, and procedurally, the position is certainly clear in my mind, and I hope I can make sure that it's clear in everyone else's. Changes in membership of select committees are made, colleagues, by this House on debatable and amendable motions. For almost all select committees, such motions are moved on behalf of the selection committee by its chair or by another member of the selection committee. Understanding Order number 121, any member intending to propose that a member be discharged from a select committee shall endeavour to give notice to the member whom he or she proposes to be discharged from the committee. In the first instance, I would refer the Honourable Lady for Totnes, the Right Honourable Lady, the Member for Enfield North, to the Honourable Member for North Herefordshire, namely the Chair of the Selection Committee. I am not aware of any current plan to remove somebody from such a committee, and I would not necessarily be even if there were such a plan. But procedurally, what I've said is, I think, accurate, and insofar as it contains advice, it's the fairest advice that I can offer. I hope that's helpful to colleagues. Thank you. I think there was a further point of order. Oh, well done. Very good. Yes. Point of order, Marcia de Cordova.
Apologies. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions published a written statement outlining changes to social security, health and disability. By my calculations, there are no fewer than 9 announcements which will have a significant impact on hundreds and thousands of ill and disabled people, including changes to the Personal Independence Payment Assessment for pensioners, the introduction of a new integrated assessment framework for ESA, Universal Credit and PIP, seeking to extend contracts on the delivery of the Failing Work Capability Assessment, yet another review of the Government's manifesto commitment of getting more disabled people into work with little or no mention to the improvements of the Access to Work scheme, a small-scale test into conditionality and sanctions, and commissioning yet more research into the understanding of the needs of disabled people, to name a few. Mr. Speaker, the written statement is vague on detail and raises significant questions, and it is vital that members are given the opportunity to question the Secretary of State about these changes. So can you please, Mr. Speaker, advise me on how best we can ensure that the Secretary of State comes to this House and answers questions from members?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for giving me notice of her intention to raise this matter. She asked me very specifically how to ensure the Secretary of State will address the House on it. The short answer to that is that, apart from departmental questions, and in the absence of an opposition day facility to probe the matter, the absence of which at present is a matter understood by members across the House, the recourse would have to be either through an urgent question, conceivably an emergency debate, or a debate to take place under the auspices of the Backbench Business Committee. Beyond that, really only an end-of-day adjournment debate or an adjournment debate in Westminster Hall would allow the matter to be aired. But those are the options in the Chamber. On the procedural question which the Honourable Lady has raised, I have to tell her, unfortunately from her point of view, but it's something that I do have to say from time to time, it is under our procedures for ministers to decide whether a statement is delivered in writing or orally in this Chamber, and also whether such statements, rather as with the granting of urgent questions, the government decides who to field, so in relation to statements, whether such statements are delivered by the relevant Secretary of State or by another, dare I say it, more junior minister. The honourable member has made clear that she finds it unsatisfactory in the cases that she has described. There are these avenues open to her if she wishes to pursue the matter, as I think she clearly does. My advice to her would be that she should discuss this matter with colleagues in her shadow ministerial team, and she might consider undertaking the short journey to the Table Office, where further advice will be available to her if she seeks it. And I hope that that is helpful to her. I do understand that some of these matters will be very pressing, as far not just as she's concerned, but as far as many colleagues are concerned, and there should be an opportunity to air them in the Chamber. If there are no further points of order, and I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for hers, I will momentarily call Mr. Alan Brown to make an application for leave to propose a debate on a specific and important matter that should have urgent consideration under the terms of Standing Order number 24. The honourable gentleman has up to 3 minutes in which to make such an application. Mr Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I wish to give formal notice to request an emergency debate under Standing Order 24 in order to discuss a specific and important matter that should have urgent consideration, namely the latest developments in UK Government ferry contracts for no-deal preparations. Mr Speaker, good governance goes hand in hand with transparency and accountability, and to date we have seen absolutely none of this in relation to the Transport Secretary's handling of the no-deal ferry contracts. In fact, every time more information has come out, more questions are raised and go unanswered. Mr Speaker, on a point of order yesterday, I highlighted my frustration about the non-answers, and that yesterday we had the Health Secretary answering from the dispatch box, and that he seemed to have the same blithe response as the Transport Secretary. It's simply not good enough. We have had a written ministerial statement, 3 urgent questions, and there have been several tests and oral questions, including 8 SNP questions at the last transport session, and all we've had is arrogant, condescending responses that have been provided.
Exactly so.
Mr Speaker, we've still to find out how Seaborne were identified as a suitable provider of what was supposed to be vital services in the event of a no-deal Brexit. A company with negative equity, no history of running ferry or freight services, no ships, no port agreements to run the ferry services, and Ramsgate Port still to be dredged to have the depth required for ferries. And yet we're told due diligence was undertaken, but it turns out the due diligence was limited by the Transport Department. And then we learn there was no financial guarantees, so when the possible backer walked away, the deal collapsed. We need to know how much of the due diligence £800,000 costs were spent in the abortive Seaborne contract. The Transport Secretary's defence lines of supporting a start-up company and that cancellation didn't matter because it wouldn't cost the taxpayer money stretches the phrase inadvertently misleading the House to the absolute limit. We were advised direct negotiation is possible under Regulation 32, which relates to an emergency situation brought about by unforeseeable events. Now, given the Government claimed to have been planning for a no-deal scenario for 2 years, how is this unforeseen? What legal advice was provided? Mr Speaker, this of course led to Eurotunnel taking the Government to court and an out-of-court settlement for £33 million. Why did the Government cave if they were confident of their legal position? Why is it now argued this £33 million settlement is actually prudent planning for a no-deal Brexit and a settlement and it's required to keep a vital medicine supply chain going? We need clarity and breakdown of compensation costs versus the so-called service improvements. Mr Speaker, there's been an anger in the House and members have not had their queries answered. So I beg to have this debate and let's get the Transport Secretary dispatch box and provide real, meaningful answers.
The honourable member asks leave to propose a debate on a specific and important matter that should have urgent consideration, namely the latest developments in UK Government ferry contract awards for no-deal preparations. I have listened carefully to the application from the honourable gentleman. I am satisfied that the matter raised is proper to be discussed under Standing Order number 24. Has the honourable member the leave of the House? Somebody is objecting. Yes, the leave having... I don't want to be unkind to the honourable gentleman. I'm not sure he altogether understands our procedures, perhaps as well as he ought to do, and as well as I do. Yes, but anyway, in fairness, the honourable gentleman is graciously conceding from a sedentary position that the 40 threshold has been reached, and I thank him for his courtesy in doing that. And if there is an objection, actually, you lot are ahead of yourselves. People tend to stand up before they need to. The objection was raised, and I'm saying this because I believe in the public intelligibility and accessibility of our proceedings, which is important. If there is an objection, as there was from the honourable gentleman, 40 members or more must rise in order that the debate can go ahead. More than 40 members have done, and therefore The standing order requirement has been satisfied. Order. The debate will be held today as the first item of public business after the 10-minute rule motion. The debate will last for up to 3 hours, and it will arise on a motion that the House has considered the specified matter set out in the honourable member's motion. Well, Mr Brown, I hope at least for now you are satisfied with the result of your prodigious efforts. The debate will come on in due course. Point of order. Yes, very well. Point of order, Mr David Hanson.
Mr Speaker, have you had any indications, given the current situation, as to whether the Secretary of State for Health or the Secretary of State for Transport will be responding to this debate? Because it is important in relation to the detail of the matters to be debated before the House today.
I think, well, the answer is, I am happy to accommodate the honourable gentleman. The presence of the Secretary of State for Transport is not ornamental. It is not ornamental. The right honourable gentleman has come in to the chamber, and my very clear understanding from the Secretary of State is that he wishes to speak in the debate, and I think my expectation is that... Order! My expectation is that the Secretary of State will speak relatively early in the debate. There's no... Order! There's no need for the honourable member for Dewsbury to chunt a ahoy there from a sentry position. Very, very eccentric behaviour. It's not the sort of thing I would ever have done as a backbencher, I feel sure. Anyway, we'll leave it there, but I welcome the Secretary of State to the chamber. First of all, let's have the presentation of Bill. Christine Jardine.
Gender-based pricing prohibition bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday, March 22nd.
Friday, March the 22nd. Thank you. Order. We come now to the 10-minute rule motion, for which the honourable member for Shipley has been waiting almost as patiently as he's been waiting for the Shipley bypass. But anyway, we're going to hear from the honourable gentleman. 10-minute rule motion. Philip Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make provision for the succession of female heirs to hereditary titles and for connected purposes. Mr Speaker, you will know that I often argue that the law should treat everyone equally, irrespective of their sex. And where that doesn't happen, I speak out. So, for example, I've spoken out to highlight where men are treated so much more harshly in the criminal justice system, and I've spoken out regarding how badly women are treated by Sharia councils. This bill would deal with another area where women are treated unfairly for no other reason than that they are a woman, and that is unacceptable and indefensible. In 2013, male primogenitor was changed to absolute primogenitor in the Succession to the Crown Act 2013, following a report on the rules of royal succession prepared by the Political and Constitutional Reform Select Committee in 2011. The report also noted that there is a continued ineligibility for women to succeed the majority of hereditary peers. My bill would seek to extend the Succession to the Crown Act to include all hereditary titles through a straightforward piece of primary legislation consisting of just a few clauses. It would quite simply mean daughters would be treated the same as sons for the purposes of succession, and it seems to me to be a very natural step to take after amending the same principle for the royal family. I obviously resist, as a Conservative, change for change's sake, but this is one of the things that both should be and could be amended. Rather like I was more than happy to see the ending of the centuries-old defence of marital coercion in criminal proceedings. A legal defence had been available to married women only in one guise or another until recently. I would add that, as is currently envisaged and drafted, the bill will not apply immediately where there is already a son due to inherit a title, and will certainly not be retrospective. If there is currently a son in line for succession, then that would remain the case. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Charlotte Carew Pole of Daughters' Rights who's in the gallery today, along with Sir David Beamish, the former Clerk of the Parliaments, for their help to bring this matter to its present state. They should both be commended for the immensely important roles they've played and the time they've spent putting together this legislation. This modest change would obviously not affect huge swathes of people. According to Debrett's peerage reports, there are apparently at present 803 hereditary peers, of which there are 24 dukes, 34 marquises, 191 earls, 115 viscounts, 426 barons, and 4 countesses and 9 baronesses in their own right. All of these could potentially be one of the 92 hereditary peers, or on the register to stand as a hereditary peer in a by-election to the House of Lords. I understand that the register of peers for the election currently has 210 peers on it, only one of whom is female, Baroness Dacre. This demonstrates that it is currently possible to already be a female hereditary peer, but clearly, because of the current system, not as routinely as if you are male, and clearly not as fair. The eldest of the 4 female descendants of the Earl of Balfour, Lady Willa Franks, commented in an article last year that she had a very tongue-in-cheek suggestion from her father that she could consider a sex change in order to overcome male primogeniture. I should add that the article did go on to say that this was clearly a very light-hearted comment from the Earl. Now, I accept, Mr. Speaker, that this is not the most important issue facing the country, but that, in my opinion, is no reason not to put right this particular unfairness. Some people might look at this as a game of numbers, that this change is needed to get more female hereditary peers into the House of Lords, but to be clear, that is definitely not where I am coming from. I refute the notion that any institution should have a particular number of men or women in it in the pursuit of what I believe is unrepresentative representation by tick box. I have often said that I couldn't care less whether, for example, the House of Commons was 100% female, as long as people are here based on fairness and real equality of opportunity. It should be irrelevant what someone's sex is. It should be their views and their contribution that count. This is arguably in the same vein as the change I am proposing today. As long as people fairly inherit titles regardless of their sex, I could not care less how many men and women it affects. That is not relevant to me at all. It's what they do with that title that should be of primary interest. So, Mr. Speaker, this is not about men versus women. This is about true equality between men and women, and I therefore commend it to the House.
Order. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. Mr Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thought I lived in the 21st century. And whilst I can commend those who are seeking to have equality within the peerage who are in the public area, I understand their frustration. It would be disingenuous of me, belonging to a political party which, first of all, fundamentally believes in the abolition of the hereditary peerage in the House of Lords and the House of Lords as it sits, but as an individual who is fundamentally opposed to the principle of privilege sanctioned by the state, that we should allow this to go undebated on the floor. If the honourable member for Shipley believed in equality, he wouldn't have given a 91-minute filibuster against the Istanbul Convention, against domestic violence. Therefore, it's for me, at least, disingenuous, to say the least, that he should take 10 minutes on the floor of the House of Commons to seek to utilise this debate on the so-called principle of equality in terms of privilege for the hereditary peerage. Now, how are we to say to the women of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, those especially in their 50s, seeking equal pension, that we will give equal rights to the privileged members of the peerage, but not to them seeking the money they paid in for a pension? Now, I've sat in debates in Westminster Hall, Mr Speaker, and I have heard members, predominantly, and I'll say actually from the government benches, saying in those Westminster Hall debates on WASPI, for example, that those women should look to their husbands to help them out. What about those women who happen to be married to other women born in the 1950s? Disingenuous to the core in terms of the principle of equality. And also, again, he talks about equality for those in the principal peerage. That would be the monarchy, princesses, duchesses, marchionesses, countesses, viscountesses, baronesses, big dames and ladies. Now, they're few and far between in West Dumbartonshire. I can tell you that, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because the women of my community, the women who have partly elected me and also participated in votes for other women candidates in my constituency, would be appalled at this disingenuous nature in terms of equality. Now, it also goes back to the honourable member talking about equality for all.
Order. Order. I have allowed the honourable gentleman to develop his argument, which he's doing with some considerable eloquence and passion. But I have been unhappy about the frequency with which he has used the word disingenuous. And the reason why I say that to the honourable gentleman is that it does entail an attribution of dishonour to the honourable gentleman, the member for Shipley. And I think it would be better if the honourable gentleman confined his argument to reasons why the bill is a bad thing. He should not impugn the integrity of the honourable member for Shipley. And he has a dexterous facility with words and a versatile vocabulary, and he can express himself in other ways which would not incur the displeasure of the Chair. Mr. Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Right. Maybe I should say no dishonour to the honourable member who is, of course, entitled to their opinion, as every other member of this House is. Though, for the record, I think he's talking tosh. In terms of the argument and the principle of equality, there is no equality when you embed privilege. Whether you be a man or a woman who sits in the honoured position of your father predominantly walloping somebody's head off in the 1100s. It is an extraordinary position that we should seek to enshrine privilege, whether it be on a man or a woman in the hereditary peerage. It is an extraordinary position in the 21st century that I and many other members across the House, not just on this side, should not go unheard in their opposition, not just in terms of the peerage in that other place, but in terms of the principle of privileged state positions. It would be, and I use the word disingenuous in regards to myself, Mr. Speaker, disingenuous of myself, and I think many members in this House who fundamentally agree with me. How has it come to pass, even today, whether it be male or female, that unaccountable, unelected members of the House of Lords, and they will forgive me, even members of the Church of England, can bring in legislation whilst they are unaccountable to the citizens of a political state? This is not a matter of equality, it is a matter of inequality. They are unaccountable not only to the men who participate in votes, but to the women of this country who fought and died for the right to participate in parliamentary democracy. It is an affront, the parliamentary privilege, for members of the House of that other place to have that state-authorised privilege. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I cannot stand here in all conscience, or even sit within these green benches, and not articulate a position to which many members, and I believe honourable, right honourable, learned, actually agree with. And that is both on these benches in the Scottish National Party, I believe even in the Labour Party, and yes, even in the Conservative Party. How can we say, how can I look my constituents in the face who are women and say that we are fighting for equality for a privileged class? If we believe in creating equality, then let's abolish the hereditary privilege of hereditary peerage. That creates a level playing field for every man and woman, however they identify themselves, and that may even confuse the honourable member for Shipley Moore, who are citizens in a liberal democracy. It cannot go unchallenged, Mr. Speaker. We cannot sit here in the 21st century, after 100 years of women gaining the right to vote, and say that this is what equality is about. Equality exists and should exist for all of us. And I pay due regard to those who have campaigned for their rights as women who are in the familial position of the peerage. I understand their situation. I believe it's an absolute outrage that they should even be in this position. But the principle still exists that privilege, no matter your gender or gender identity, state-sanctioned against the majority of your majority of your fellow citizens, is not equality, Mr. Speaker. It is fundamentally a position which none of us should agree with in the 21st century. And I know you're keen to move on, so let me maybe come to a point of summing up. I won't push this to a vote, the Honourable Member for Shipley will be delighted to hear, because I do fundamentally understand the principle for those who have campaigned for this bill. But it cannot be in a parliamentary democracy that we believe that someone whose father, as I said, in the 12th century, chopped somebody's head off, not head for Hansard, but head, has a place of honour and economic privilege and political leverage in a parliamentary democracy. It is an affront to those who have campaigned to ensure liberty and dignity for all. And I belong to a political party, Mr. Speaker, that believes that citizenship and equality of citizenship should not be based on who your father was. It should not be based on your economic privilege. It should be based that you are born free, male or female, that you have a disability, that you be of a minority ethnic community, and that because you are part of a privileged society, you should have no truck in telling me unaccountable and held unaccountable to the citizenry of this state. You should get no inch, and they won't, from me or my political party.
Thank you. Order. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Harriet Harman, Sir Christopher Chope, Jess Phillips, Esther McVeigh, Christine Jardine, Tim Lawton, Mrs Maria Miller, Vicky Ford, Sarah Champion, Joe Swinson and myself.
And he gets some good timing.
Mr Philip Davis.
Hereditary Titles, Female Succession Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 22nd of March.
Friday the 22nd of March. Thank you. Order. We now come to the emergency debate to take place under Standing Order number 24.
Thank you.
Mr Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I beg to move that this House has considered the latest developments in the UK Government Ferry Contract Awards for no-deal preparations. Mr Speaker, can I put on record my thanks to you for granting this debate? Mr Speaker, you asked me earlier on if I was happy now, and I was happy, but with a short period of time to prepare for this debate, I hope you forgive me if you realise there's a bit of cursing at the same time as well. But I'm really glad to have secured this debate. We've had a Transport Secretary who's tried to duck some important issues and has to be dragged kicking and screaming to the dispatch box. And we can see him, here we go, yet again, the head shaking started, the shuntering, oh, we're talking nonsense, we don't understand anything. That is why this emergency debate has been granted. And I say to members opposite, members that objected to this emergency debate, This is all about transparency and accountability and how the government has been run. And if they wanted, and I'll give you in a minute, and they should share the concerns that we in these benches have about this lack of accountability, about the lack of transparency, and the fact that these no-deal preparations have been a pure and utter shambles. And I'll give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Assuming he wishes to respect democracy and therefore deliver on the Brexit decision of the British people, what plans would he have in place to ensure that life-saving, life-enhancing medicines will get across the English Channel post-Brexit?
Well, let's see. Perhaps I would get the no deal off the table, and then we wouldn't be heading to that cliff edge where we're saying there's going to be medicines not coming through. That's what I would do to start. Then we should also be looking at extending Article 50 to try and give this incompetent government some time to do some real preparations. Again, I've no faith that any more time would actually work for them. Mr. Speaker, I spoke about transparency and accountability, and I must say I'd like to put in record my thanks to the journalist who first broke the story in the new year about seaborne freight. Thanks to the Public Accounts Committee and the National Audit Office for the work they've done so far in terms of assessing the diligence. And of course, honourable members across this House have raised some very important questions, including my friend, honourable member for South West, who first raised the matter of the likely illegal tendering process. Mr. Speaker, we've still to get to the bottom of this overall process. It started in secrecy, it's been shrouded in secrecy ever since, and the non-answers and evasion of answers from the Transport Secretary has not helped us get any further clarity. Mr. Speaker, his department has actually got form when it comes to previous procurement issues. A number of years ago, we had the collapse of the West Coast Mainline franchise, which came about because of another court action challenge, and that's resulted in Virgin being given a direct award to extend their services, which clearly does not provide best value for money for the taxpayer. If the Transport Secretary so much believes in competition and privatisation, then we'll have to ask why are so many rail franchises subject to direct award, the very opposite of competitive tendering. We've had the Southern Rail franchise model, which has clearly failed, and again, much of that failure due to lack of inaction from the Transport Secretary and somebody just want to have a fight with the unions rather than try and improve matters and get services up and running. So that's the background in terms of some of the systemic failings in terms of procurement within the Transport Department, and that brings us neatly to where we are right now, Mr. Speaker. When information first surfaced about the award of the seaborne freight contract, it was almost like a sick joke. So this was an emergency contract for a company to provide emergency services. The honourable member earlier on intervened about vital services in order to keep medicines running, and yet this government, the Transport Secretary, chose to pick a ferry company that had no boats. Yes. It had negative equity of £374,000. It had no history of running ferry or freight services. A director, Brian Raincock, and Ben Sharp, the chief executive, both had previous companies liquidated own HMRC money, with Raincock's debt at £600,000. Now, I remind the House, HMRC is effectively all of us, the taxpayer. What then constituted the due diligence and what red flags were identified at that time? We've still to no answers to that. As I touched on earlier on, Mr. Speaker, it turns out the due diligence that the Transport Secretary heralded was actually very limited. It was a very high-level due diligence, which then means it's not due diligence, and the companies doing the diligence confirmed that they couldn't do a proper assessment of the merits of Seaborne getting this supposedly vital contract. So again, we need to ask, and the Transport Secretary needs to start answering, how on earth did Seaborne get handpicked for this direct negotiation, given the circumstances? How did that happen? Saying it only accounted for 10% of the vital services is no answer. Saying it's supporting a vital British start-up company is certainly not an answer. Why do we go hand-picking start-up companies for vital emergency services? That makes no sense whatsoever. And clearly it was so far wrong that that led us to Eurotunnel getting their £33 million settlement. So hopefully, while the Transport Secretary is shaking his head, he is actually managing to multitask and listen to these points, and will answer them once it comes to the dispatch box. I'll give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. Would he not agree that that figure of 33 million is not dissimilar to the 30 for something that never materialised, the Phantom Ferry contract, is not dissimilar to the £30 million that his department, not this Secretary of State, but his predecessor, committed to the Garden Bridge, which there is nothing to show for either. It's not even directly a transport project. And he mentioned rail upgrades. Vital rail upgrades elsewhere in the country were cancelled when this money was committed to this project. It's taxpayer money, and they shouldn't laugh at this appalling waste.
Thank the honourable member for highlighting yet another miserable failure, and more money has been thrown down the drain. I would say it's interesting that £33 million to Eurotunnel for these vital services, which in one way or another would seem to replace the seaborne freight contract, which is only £14 million. So we really do have to ask, what extra are we getting for the £33 million? Or is this all the compensation that Eurotunnel walk away with, and the taxpayer has got no chance of recouping? So again, the Transport Secretary really needs to explain this. Again, I'll touch on the fact that they've argued direct negotiation was possible under Regulation 32, which relates to the emergency situation brought about by unforeseeable events. So, over 2 years of no-deal planning, and suddenly we had an unforeseen event. An unforeseen event, however, that allowed such protracted negotiations and £800,000 worth of due diligence. I would like the Transport Secretary to explain how long was negotiations ongoing in these supposedly emergency situation position, because when you spend £800,000 of consultants' money, that's a fair bit of time in negotiation. So it needs to explain when the actual emergency situation kicked in. And I repeat, saying that the argument at the dispatch box saying that seaborne freight would only receive money if they delivered the service missed the point, because it missed the point that if they didn't deliver the service, then the emergency service they were contracted for wouldn't happen, and that would leave the government in a right mess in terms of no-deal preparations. And of course, he's also argued seaborne hasn't cost the taxpayer any money. So hopefully he'll re-explain these figures, because I would like to know how £800,000 worth of due diligence, at the very least some of that was on seaborne freight, how that's not cost any money. Why did going to court and defending the government's position not cost any money? How did an out-of-court settlement with Eurotunnel at £33 million not cost any money that was related to seaborne? Because I'm pretty sure a key plank of Eurotunnel's objections is the fact that the Transport Secretary gave an important contract to a company with no ships. Meanwhile, Eurotunnel are a company that obviously provides successful cross-border services. It is no wonder they were at court. I would like to ask the Transport Secretary as well, is there any more objections outstanding? Is there any more risks of court action? Because in a written parliamentary question, I was given the answer that a limited number of representations were received. Now, in my book, a limited number is more than one. So we've only had one court case today. Is there any more court cases pending? Are we absolutely sure about that? Given the Transport Minister's ability to count, I hate my doubts, as you say, Mr. Speaker. Now, he's never been able to answer with the failing of or the loss of the 10% seaborne contract. What would that actually mean for the impact in Dover? Because Dover is so sensitive, even 10% would have a massive effect. We've heard about the fact that like 1.5 to 2 minutes additional checks per lorry could lead to 30-mile tailbacks. Fortunately, in the Transport Secretary's competent planning for no deal, we know that the government's planned for these 10,000 lorries by doing an exercise of 89 lorries.
Couldn't get 100.
Driving up and down the motorway. And accept that intervention in the bin wagon. So 89 lorries driving the motorway, parking up at Marston Airport, successfully proves this government can handle no-deal preparations. Mr. Speaker, I am relieved. I am happy at that. I've all my faith in the Transport Secretary.
I thank him for giving way. Is he aware that, in fact, according to reports, what those lorries were mostly doing was actually sitting stationary while the drivers were drinking cups of coffee? So I'm not sure that the Secretary of State would have learned too much from that.
£500 a lorry.
Well, at least in terms of air pollution, the lorries weren't polluting as much if the drivers were just sitting drinking coffee. So I'm sure they enjoyed the exercise anyway. But it really does illustrate a key point. If the government's seriously saying they're ready for a no-deal preparation or a no-deal Brexit, they need to up their game in terms of what they're doing and show some level of competency. And again, I don't see many members opposite really want to justify that exercise or how the government handled that. Yeah.
Grateful to the honourable gentleman, and can I congratulate him on securing this debate this afternoon. Can I also just say that does he share my concerns about the lack of planning for other ports around the country, where the Department of Transport have been very lackadaisical, it seems to me, and the ministers, in actually making sure that if there is a no-deal scenario, that those ports will be able to operate?
I thank her for that intervention. I assume she's speaking in particular in reference to ports in the north east of England. And of course it seems like the Department of Transport haven't engaged with any of the Scottish ports either. It's all about mitigating in and around Dover, which is fine. Dover's clearly the biggest and busiest port. But one way to mitigate the traffic impact at Dover would be to stop as much traffic travelling from the north to the south and looking at these other ports and actually doing some real strategic planning. Strategic planning is here severely lacking for the Department of Transport. Yeah.
I listened to what he's been saying to the House with great interest, and representing the constituency of Dover, he will understand that this is a subject that is very dear to my heart. But nevertheless, in any negotiation, if we end up, we have to have contingency planning. It's very important, and it is right that the Department for Transport do take measures to ensure that if there were disruptions at France, as have been threatened by some French politicians, that they have alternatives and different ways of getting goods in and out of the country, notwithstanding. Does he not think that, in principle, the Department for Transport were doing what they were doing was actually acting in the national interest?
Well, if I take his final point, then we could argue in principle the Department of Transport is trying to do the right things in terms of contingency planning, because let's face it, a no-deal Brexit could happen. So in principle, yes. In practice, it's been a pure and utter failure, a shambles, and that's the difference. Contingency planning needs to be absolutely that, to put in place proper, robust procedures for the contingencies should it arise. And it's quite clear that that's not happened. Briefly.
The honourable gentleman for allowing me. I've read, I'm sure he has, with interest, the National Audit Office detailed report into this. And I have to say, the NAO report goes through the decision-making in the Department for Transport and doesn't come across to me as highly critical, and they highlight that the additional freight capacity is intended to allow the government to prioritise the flow of critical goods into the UK and to enable imports to flow as freely as possible in the event of no deal. It has to be in the national interest that we make sure we get things like medicines and other such critical goods into the country and that we're prepared for every eventuality. Does he not accept that as a matter of principle, yes or no?
Well, I thank him for gamely trying to defend the government position, so fair play to him. There's only one willing to do that. Now, clearly there's I'll give way in a minute. So there's a National Audit report. I'd like to see the honourable member go and argue with the Public Account Commission and all the members sitting in that National Audit report was reassuring and that the evidence they took was reassuring, because that's not what I've heard from members of the Public Accounts Committee. So, again, I disagree. And then if we talk about if it was really a robust process, the government would have defended itself to the hilt in court. It wouldn't have then caved and done an out-of-court settlement. So again, that is indicative of where the government is and the lack of confidence they had once they were eight-balled by Eurotunnel. And I'll give way to the honourable member.
I thank the honourable friend for giving way. Just in response to the comment made by the honourable member for Dover, I also read the NAO report, and it said ignored warnings and rushed ineffective and inappropriate privatisation creating significant risks, wasted £500 million, and the number of recalled prisoners skyrocketed. But that was about his careless probation service legacy, so it's clear he's got a track record. And as a master of understatement, he said these reforms haven't worked as well as we'd hoped.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. I spoke earlier on about systemic procurement failures in the Department of Transport, and it's quite clear there's a common thread there between the systemic failure and the privatisation and procurement of the probation services, and the man that's now in charge, sitting here, quite lackadaisical, thinks everything's okay in the world and that he's doing a fine job. Well, I'm sorry, that is not the case, and that's not how it's seen in the wider country. Mr Speaker, I will return to some questions that have been raised in the Chamber and that have still not had satisfactory answers. And that was the fact that the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Transport told the Public Accounts Committee that the DfT had awarded Seaborne the contract before Arklow confirmed its backing. So the Transport Secretary needs to be able to provide further clarity on that. And again, we return to the fact that where was these written guarantees that he was supposedly assured about from Arklow before they walked away? And also, Mr Speaker, I think it's shameful that it turns out, as far as we know, there was no written guarantees given by Arklow, but yet when they walked away, some of the most hard Brexiteers, the right-wing Brexiteers, were somehow saying it was an Irish conspiracy. It's because they're an Irish company. That's shameful. It was the Department of Transport not doing their due diligence. Now, additionally, the Director-General to the Department for Transport has said it was no longer possible to complete procurement and operation for any large amount of further capacity across the Channel before the end of March by either sea or rail. So, can the Transport Secretary explain that? Can he explain how this sudden £33 million settlement with Eurotunnel then, which if it's going to provide all these vital services at the end of March, how that stacks with the fact that the previous argument was the Department no longer has the time to be able to source these additional services? If I return to the fact that in relation to Seaborne Freight, he said we did not spend any money in this contract. So once again, I ask the Secretary of State, please spell out the real financial implications of that award to Seaborne Freight and the handling of the direct negotiations.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to him for giving way. At the risk of being called a sort of government narc, which I'm not really being referred to much as at the moment, if this SO24 is so important to the SNP, where are they?
Well, I feel I've got more friends in here than I would have down the pub on a Friday night. I feel it's a really good turnout for SNP. And if you take that in relation to there's only 35 of us, it's a pretty good turnout. Yeah. Wow! Oh, wait a minute. I don't understand that intervention. Wait, once we take out private secretaries and a front bench, how many backbenchers are there from the Conservative Party? And how many are rushing to speak in this debate and defend the government's handling? I think that's the question the honourable member wants to ask himself.
Where are the Scottish Tories?
Scottish Tories hiding in the cupboard.
Grateful to the honourable member for giving me. He is, of course, aware that the member for Whaley and Whitford is a leading member of the European Research Group, which advocates a no-deal Brexit. So, given that this issue pertains to no-deal Brexit planning, why are there so few members of the European Research Group here?
It's a fair point, and of course it was pointed out from a senior position. There is no Scottish Tories here. The Scottish Tories that would stand up for Scotland do a good job for here and be independent leading voices. Well, where are they? But sure, I'll give way once more.
Sorry, through him, and I thank him for his courtesy, I was responding to the Labour gentleman sitting up at the back there, I think. One of you.
SNP as well.
Oh, I'm so sorry. There's about 13 of you. I do apologise. Most of the ERG are, as I speak, working towards how our country can be free, so they're otherwise engaged.
Keep digging. There's been a certain amount of frivolity on the matter of attendance at the debate, but perhaps we can now return to the theme of the debate, rather than having a constant competition as to who can be more amusing at the other's expense on the matter of attendance. Mr Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So to return to a substantive point, in terms of procurement, and I touched on rail franchising earlier, but the Secretary of State always says he believes in competition. So if he believes in competition, why did we have this secretive direct negotiation process? What is competitive about that, and how would that provide value for money for the taxpayer? And will they come to the dispatch box and actually justify the expenditure and give us detailed rationale of how he has actually managed to provide value for money for the taxpayer in this entire process?
With me that the ending of Seaborne's contract hasn't in fact cost the taxpayer a penny.
Well, I thank the honourable member for her intervention, because it proves either she doesn't listen or, like the Transport Secretary, doesn't understand the meaning of spending money. It resulted in the out-of-court settlement of £33 million. It resulted in legal fees, which we're still to hear how much. It's resulted in further risk to the government, and it resulted in the due diligence costs. So that, to me, seems to be quite a hefty expenditure, loosely relating to the Seaborne contract. So, it's getting tiresome, but yeah, one more.
Thank you for giving way one more time. And I am glad to see the interest of Scottish MPs in this matter of trade across the English Channel. And I have to say, looking again at the NAO report, it's very clear that the Department considered that it had to take a faster process, because he castigates the Department for not advertising it and doing the usual procurement. It says here that the regulations allow for the award of a contract for a negotiating procedure without prior publication where time is of the essence. And that is clearly what the Department did. And given the way the clock is ticking, it seems to me that it's hard to say that it's unreasonable for that to have been done.
I thank the honourable member for trying once more. Now, the EU referendum was in June 2016. And as I said earlier on, the government's supposed to be doing no-deal planning for over 2 years. So why then did it suddenly become an emergency issue? At what point did the Transport Secretary go, oh shoot, we might have a no-deal Brexit, we need to put in some plans to deal with this? So, again, I rebut the honourable member's intervention. And by the way, it was also, Mr Speaker, it's a fact that it took until October 2018 before the Transport Secretary even bothered to visit the port of Dover, yet it was supposed to be so critical. Why did it take so long to actually go and see the operations in person? And I'll give way
to him for giving way. Is he as surprised as I am to hear that no costs have been incurred in this? He's highlighted the £800,000 that was paid out to consultants. There's also the cost of the dredging of the port. And we were told by the Permanent Secretary that that was paid for by Seaborne. This was a contract that was cancelled. Is he surprised as I am that Seaborne bore the cost themselves? Or is it...
I thank for that intervention, and I'm actually very surprised, because I put in a written parliamentary question asking how much the Department of Transport has paid towards the dredging the port of Ramsgate, and the answer I was given was nothing. So I'll be further challenging that, because again we need to get to the bottom of this, because we know full well that operation wasn't happening for nothing. We know full well the Transport Secretary was lobbying Thanet Council not to keep the port open because of the negotiation with Seaborne. So there's more to run in that as well, and I thank the honourable member, the Shadow Minister, the Shadow Secretary, for bringing that up. Mr Speaker, I'll turn back to Eurotunnel briefly. So again, we know it was an out-of-court settlement. It was effectively the government caving. The good thing about the government caving is we learned that that's 10,000 documents are still going to keep secret in terms of commercial confidentiality, which makes it much harder for us to get to the bottom of this. We know they didn't have any confidence in their own position when they settled out of court. But we need to understand why yesterday did we have a Health Secretary at the dispatch box telling us this is such an important contract, this keeps medicines coming into the UK, this is why we did this, this is why we negotiated £33 million with Eurotunnel. It's not about compensation, it's about these vital services and improvements. So again, I repeat, we need clarity. If it was such a vital provision at £33 million, why did it take Eurotunnel taking the government to court? Why was Eurotunnel as a reputable provider not identified before when we were looking at seaborne freight?
Pretty obvious.
Thank you, member, for that. And how much of this £33 million has gone forever to Eurotunnel's compensation? How much and what services are we going to see And what updates is the House going to be given on the progress of these vital services that the government's procured? Because, Mr Speaker, I'll say it, the Transport Secretary has been lax at updating this House from start to finish, with one written ministerial statement at the outset which he thought would head off the bad press that had happened with seaborne freight. Then we've had to have 3 urgent questions and now this emergency debate. And of course, sometimes he hasn't even turned up to the dispatch box himself. That, Mr Speaker, says everything about the Transport Secretary's confidence in his own competence, the fact that he's unwilling to come to the dispatch box and state his case clearly and leave himself open to questions to members. In terms of procurement, Mr Speaker, I also touched on yesterday, it looks like Bechtel are going to sue the government over the HS2 tender process. So will I identify what other department risks are there in terms of procurement? What review of the procurement process is he instigated? Who's heading up the review? And when will the report on this? Because it's quite clear some sort of procurement review is absolutely vital. Mr Speaker, I'll finish in terms of, once again, the litany of failures of the Transport Secretary. So we heard about the near £600 million in terms of the privatisation of the probation service when he was at Minister of Justice.
Could you just confirm to the House that the probation service contracts are running around £1 billion under budget?
It's a shambles.
Well, I can confirm that. So he's quite comfortable with his legacy there. So I'll leave that to him and I'll leave that on record, because it seems to be a legacy that nobody else is appreciating, including in particular the current minister trying to deal with his mess. So.
Can you give way on that? I'm very grateful to our honourable friend for giving way. I can't believe the Secretary has stood up and defended these probation service reforms. I serve on the Justice Select Committee, and that committee and the ministers that have replaced him and his team have said time and time again that this is a shambles of a service. So I'm absolutely amazed that he stood up to defend it on this occasion, and does my honourable friend agree with him?
I wholeheartedly agree with him, but to be fair to the Transport Secretary, I would say this: a Transport Secretary that allowed the Virgin Stagecoach Consortia, VTEC, to walk away owing the taxpayers £2 billion. But this is the Transport Secretary that said, although they owed £2 billion, it's not a taxpayer bailout. Now, if I let somebody off who owed me £2 billion, that seems to me I've bailed them out.
You wouldn't let him do it for a pint, though.
He's also, I touched on earlier on, the Transport Secretary had a lot of culpability in the Southern Rail franchise. The way the model is set up, his lack of willingness to get involved in industrial disputes. In fact, in a way he wanted the industrial disputes to continue because of his views in the unions. We've had the Northern Rail timetable fiasco, where again the government tries to argue that the taxpayer wasn't liable for money, but yet when Network Rail pays compensation to a franchise holder, then that money comes from the taxpayer. Of course, we've had all this as well. So the 800,000 due diligence, the out-of-court settlement for Eurotunnel, a farce from start to end. A Transport Secretary not willing to take accountability. And I'll just go.
I think, honourable friend, forgive me. I just think when we're hearing these lists of how the opposite of the Midas Church has affected so many aspects of public policy, we shouldn't forget the introduction of English votes for English laws to this House, which was undertaken when the right honourable member was the leader of the House, and turned the whole House frankly into a shambolic laughingstock whenever they're trying to be intervened.
Now, but the honourable gentleman must confine himself to the subject matter of today's debate, the terms of which have been specified and which the Secretary of State will answer. It cannot be a general ad hominem attack on the Secretary of State or a replay of other matters to which members want to object at an earlier point in the Secretary of State's career. It's got to be on today's matter. Mr. Alan Brown.
Very difficult. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll take some guidance on that, and I'll perhaps spare the Transport Secretary any more of his litany of failures. Now, he's already survived what was effectively a vote of no confidence before, but I've called, and the Shadow Secretary said several times he should be sacked. I've actually do the right thing and step aside. And, Mr Speaker, it's absolutely abundantly clear his handling of this shambles has been truly shameful. I'll be interested to hear what he says at the dispatch box, but I, for one, have no confidence in his handling of this, and he really should think about walking.
Question is that this House has considered the latest developments in the UK Government ferry contract awards for no deal preparations. I call the Secretary of State for Transport, Secretary Chris Grayling.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. As I've explained to the House on several previous occasions, the Government entered into contracts with ferry operators to provide additional ferry capacity and services into the UK as part of no-deal EU contingency planning. And the reality is, what we've heard very clearly this afternoon, is the SNP doesn't believe in preparing for no deal, even though the honourable gentleman accepted it was a possibility, that was a risk, a danger. He does not support us preparing for the risk of a no-deal exit. Now, the reality, well, the front bench opposite says take it off the table. Mr Speaker, we can only take no deal off the table either by reversing Brexit or agreeing a deal. And the reality is the two parties opposite have spent week after week after week trying to prevent a deal, voting against a deal, trying to disrupt the process of getting towards a deal. And frankly, Mr Speaker, they are acting anything but the national interest in doing so. Whereas we have been acting in the national interest in preparing for all eventualities. Yes, sir.
The Secretary of State for giving way, but if he really believes that no deal should be an option, why on earth didn't the government begin preparations sooner?
We have been preparing, Mr Speaker, for a no-deal exit for months and months and months. And there was a particular reason, as I'll set out in a moment, for this particular procurement at this particular time. But my department has been working for months and months to prepare for the risk of a no-deal. You will find that in the new international aviation agreements that we've reached. You will find it in Kent, where we've put in place alternative resilience systems to the deeply disruptive Operation Stack, and many other things we've done. I give way.
I think we're over giving way. It's not just in this instance, actually, where we see the parties opposite not acting in the national interest, but it's also in terms of statutory instruments as well. It's a constant refrain. So would my right honourable friend agree with me that the only way in which we take no deal off the table is by voting for the Prime Minister's deal, and it's time for the parties opposite to put narrow party politics aside?
Absolutely.
Very good point.
All we've heard for month after month after month is why the government's getting this wrong. We have no tangible plans from them, no realistic plans from them, and at every attempt, at every opportunity, they simply work to disrupt the Brexit process. And this is a party that stood on a manifesto respecting the referendum result. They do anything but respect the referendum result, and if they continue to disrupt the Brexit process, they will pay a heavy price in their heartlands who did vote for Brexit. I'll give way.
Thank my right honourable friend for giving way. I've been reading this NAO report with considerable interest, and it says here that over the summer of 2018, government departments stepped up their contingency preparations for no deal. Isn't the truth of it that government policy changed in the summer of 2018 to step up those contingency plans, and the Department for Transport was acting from that point onwards because wider government was moving from that point onwards?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, though I have to say we started some of our planning well before that. But it is certainly the case that last summer, as we saw the process of negotiations, the government stepped up its preparations for no deal, as any responsible government should. And it is quite extraordinary that the party opposite seem to believe you can just wave a wand and take no deal off the table. We have voted to leave the European Union. We will either leave the European Union with a deal, or we will reverse Brexit, or we will leave without a deal. Those are the only three options.
I thank him for giving way. In terms of preparing for no deal, is it not right that the government did indeed step up their preparations, as he has quite rightly told the House? But one of the points of debate has been the speed at which the Chancellor of the Exchequer has been prepared to release funding to individual departments in order to facilitate those preparations. Does he think it would be helpful if in future the Chancellor of the Exchequer were to lean forward a bit more to make sure that all those preparations are fully funded in good time?
Well, Mr Speaker, I think I'll leave my honourable friend to make his point. I don't want to start discussing debates and discussions within government. But the reality is, let me actually set out now. The honourable gentleman asked why we launched this procurement when we did. So what actually happened, Mr Speaker, and I've said in this House before, is that we had been preparing, and indeed the National Health Service had been preparing, for disruption at the ports that lasted approximately 6 weeks after exit day. What happened late last autumn was the analysts, based on the process taking place in negotiations, comments coming from Brussels, and what we saw happening on the other side of the Channel, changed that assumption and recommended to government that we prepared for a longer period of disruption. And at that point, the Department for Health rightly highlighted the fact that that would put significant pressures on their stockpiles of drugs. And so, therefore, we, collectively across government, as a result of decisions in cabinet committees, took a decision to go to the ferry industry and to secure capacity to guarantee the delivery of drugs to this country in the event of a no-deal Brexit. That was a collective decision. It was the right decision. And what we did, Mr Speaker, is we talked to all of the current ferry operators operating across the North Sea and the English Channel, plus any other operator that had tangible plans to do so. And that is where the procurement came from. I give way.
For giving way on that point. Isn't the key question, however, did he have advice from his officials that negotiations solely with ferry companies would result in a legal challenge by Eurotunnel, which ultimately he has now paid off by a £33 million investment from taxpayers?
So, Mr Speaker, we knew in accelerating the procurement process that there was a legal risk. That's been highlighted in the NAO report. However, it was my judgment and the judgment of my accounting officer and the judgment of those who vetted the plan across government that this was a risk that we should take, given the need to ensure that we had a supply of drugs into the country in the event of a no-deal Brexit.
Deliberate point, then. On that deliberate point, Mr Speaker, if he has said there was a legal judgment that there was an element of risk, he has taken that risk, and he, therefore, has cost the state £33 million by his actions.
Mr Speaker, we took a collective decision in the light of the legal advice taken by myself, by my accounting officer, and by those who approved this across government. And we did so, Mr Speaker, because we judged it important to ensure that we had a proper supply of drugs to the NHS in the event of a no-deal Brexit. And I challenge the party opposite to their chanter from the front benches to say they disagree with ensuring that we can have a supply of drugs to the UK in a no-deal Brexit.
For him to give way. I've been listening very carefully and very intently to what he's been saying. The thing that really surprises and shocks me is the fact that there is a complete lack of humility with regards to the fact that £33 million of public money, taxpayers' money, has been wasted. Could he just stand up and say sorry to them?
I very much regret the fact that we were taken to court. It was a risk that we acknowledged was there, but I stand by the decision to make sure that we could guarantee the supply of drugs to the NHS in the event of a no-deal Brexit. I give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does my honourable friend agree with me that proper preparation is an important role of government, and that frightening people unnecessarily, particularly those who are vulnerable and dependent on medicines such as those with epilepsy, is completely irresponsible and unkind? And can he confirm to my constituents that the medicines will be available regardless of whether we have a no deal or the Prime Minister's deal Brexit?
I can absolutely confirm that, Mr Speaker. And I think it's absolutely right and proper that we took the steps necessary to ensure that continuity of supply, and we did so. And we did so with a collective decision across government taken by cabinet committees.
I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way, but doesn't he understand and accept that what he's laying bare today is advice that he received? He's acted in contravention of that advice, and he has lost. What we're asking for is not an absence of preparation for contingencies. What we're asking for is a modicum of competence, and he singularly failed.
We did not receive legal advice saying do not do this. We received legal advice, Mr Speaker, saying that there was a risk in taking this approach. And we judged collectively across government that this was a risk that was necessary to take in the national interest. And the reality is, now I'm going to make a bit of progress because I've given way a lot of times. Now, Let me touch briefly on the issue of seaborne freight, which was raised exhaustively by the honourable gentleman, and which I've answered question after question about in this House, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, to be clear, the agreement with Eurotunnel was not about the contract with seaborne freight. It was about the procurement process, and particularly about the continuing contracts we have with Brittany Ferries and DFDS for additional ferry capacity into the UK to provide us with that resilience. Now, I've spoken exhaustively in this House about seaborne freight. I'm disappointed the contract had to be terminated. I stand by the decision to give that company a chance, particularly since they were backed by Ireland's biggest shipping firm at the time. We have, as a government, paid no money at all to Seabourn. And he keeps asking me about spending money on due diligence. We spend money on due diligence for contracts we don't award, as well as contracts we do. Because rightly and properly, Mr. Speaker, when you receive a tender of any sort in government, you do due diligence. That is what we did in this case and what we do in all other situations. That, again, is the right thing to do. And so it is absolutely clear, I want to be absolutely clear, Mr. Speaker, that when it comes to the Eurotunnel litigation, the settlement struck between the government and Eurotunnel was separate to the issue of the seaborne debate, and it was struck, I think, Mr. Speaker, in a way that is designed to ensure that the taxpayer actually receives value through the addition of important facilities at the border that will smooth the flows between them.
On this point, will he give way? Will the Secretary of State give way on that point?
Was a challenge to the procurement process, which I said I took detailed legal advice at the time on procuring, which my accounting officer took into account when awarding these contracts. And we expected that if a legal challenge was brought, any court determination would be brought well after Brexit and would not disrupt the process. All of this, as you will be aware, Mr. Speaker, has already been looked at by the National Audit Office. We've invited them to take a further look, but I stand by the decisions that we took. And these were decisions not simply taken by me and by my department, they were decisions taken collectively in the national interest. I'll give way.
Can he confirm, just for the record, that not a single penny of the £33 million paid out to Eurotunnel will be returned in the event that there is a deal? Can he confirm that for the record?
Mr. Speaker, the deal that we've done is to pay for additional facilities at the border, to create a smoother flow at the border. That is something that we will benefit from at the borders. Now, Mr. Speaker...
Order! No, order. And look, I understand passions are high, but the honourable and learned lady mustn't say that the Secretary of State is not telling the truth, because that is order. That is an imputation of dishonesty. The honourable and learned lady may think that the Secretary of State is wrong, but I'm afraid before the debate proceeds further, she must withdraw that charge. I'm not debating it. Well, what I say to the honourable and learned lady, I'm chairing this debate. The honourable and learned lady will speak in full or otherwise if and when she catches the eye of the chair. Thank you. The Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I just simply reiterate, the settlement we have reached with Eurotunnel is going to pay for improved facilities at the border, to improve flow, to make sure that our border through the tunnel works more smoothly in the future, particularly in the post-Brexit world. That is a simple, factual point about the settlements being reached.
For giving way one more time, he will know that the Port of Dover could see the legal risk of the process that he had undertaken, but decided to act in the national interest. Will he make sure that the Port of Dover is not in any way disadvantaged in relation to this matter?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have to say that the management of the Port of Dover have been exemplary in the last few weeks in cooperating with us not only over this but in preparations for no deal. They rightly judged that it was not in their corporate reputational benefit to try and block the delivery of drugs to the NHS in a post-Brexit world. I am disappointed that not everyone took the same view. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to now make some progress. I'm going to make some progress now. Mr. Speaker, I simply want to reiterate the point. We have taken the decisions, we collectively in government. Back in November, we collectively, a couple of weeks ago, we collectively about this settlement have taken the view that we need first and foremost to put the national interest first, that we need to make sure this country is ready for a no-deal exit, even though we are working very hard to make sure that does not happen. We are working very hard to make sure that we are prepared for all eventualities. That is the responsible thing for government to do. Sometimes you have to take some risks in doing that, but I think sensible governments take risks in the national interest. I and we and all of my colleagues who took this decision collectively stand by this decision. We're deeply sorry that it did not work out in the way we'd intended, but the reality is it was the right decision to take because we were putting the national interest and particularly patients in our National Health Service first, and that, Mr Speaker, you would expect any responsible government to do.
Thank you. Mr Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it's good to see the Transport Secretary finally in his place today, having tried and failed to bring him to the House yesterday. Instead, he sent the Health Secretary as his human shield, but this comes as no surprise considering how this Transport Secretary has made a habit of treating this House with disdain, and perhaps he'll reflect upon that. I'd like to thank the honourable member for Kilmarnock and Loudoun for securing this debate. Understandably, the Health Secretary wasn't able to answer the questions put to him yesterday, so I'm going to have another go at getting some answers out of the Transport Secretary, though I'm not holding my breath. In the papers filed at court in the weeks before the case was due to be heard, the government lawyers described Eurotunnel's case as embarrassing, and they were bullish and confident. Yet in the early hours of the morning of March the 1st, a settlement was reached between the government and the company. The sequence of events raises many still unanswered questions.
On that point, will you agree?
I will indeed.
Does he agree with me that there is at least an apparent conflict between the reported out-of-court settlement of £33 million and the Secretary of State's claim that the £33 million is to pay for, and I quote, improved security, and that really we ought to be trying to get to the bottom of whether that's accurate or not?
I think the honourable lady makes a very important point, and I'm going to be returning to that very issue in a few minutes' time. I will indeed. Yeah.
Thank you for giving way. I tried to intervene the Transport Secretary of this. Was he surprised as myself that it's only after the out-of-court settlement with Eurotunnel has been agreed that suddenly this was all about medicines? We've had all these other urgent questions and medicines was never mentioned, but we come to the Eurotunnel settlement and suddenly it's a health-led initiative. Did you share my surprise?
I think the honourable member's got to concede there's got to be some justification for bringing the wrong Secretary of State to the dispatch box, and if you can find a hook to hang it on, it's as good as any. But it was a nice try, but it failed totally. I'll give it.
Honourable friend for giving way. Has my honourable friend noticed that every time the government gets it wrong through its incompetence, the excuse is it's in the national interest, yet when Labour governments make mistakes, it's a different thing altogether?
Friend makes a very pertinent point. I'm just astonished that people can hide behind what they perceive as being the national interest. I fail to see how it is in the national interest to pour millions of pounds of taxpayers' money down the drain. I don't call that the national interest at all. I will indeed.
Turn to some of the questions that he would like the Secretary of State to answer. Does he agree that one of them should be around the due diligence process that was carried out? Because the company that carried out that due diligence say that they couldn't ask the normal questions of Seaborne because of the fact that they were such a new entity. So how could the government be any way confident in the risk aversion that they were providing in awarding that contract to Seaborne in the first place?
That is a very, very good question. I've raised the point myself because those that were inquiring into the bona fides of these companies were restricted in the scope that they were given. And why on earth they did not look in to the track record of the individuals concerned at Seaborne is beyond me. It is well known. A mere cursory search of Google would tell you about the track record of Ben Sharp in his dealings in the Gulf, but seemingly that wasn't considered. Absolutely well-made point. So I return to this settlement that was achieved on the 1st of March. So I want to know why the Department for Transport was so confident about winning the case only a week before. What brought the sudden change in strategy towards the legal challenge? The DfT clearly thought it could win. Who intervened? And what was the view taken by other departments, Health, Treasury or Downing Street? Why did they take a different view from the DfT? Yes. Why did the government not settle earlier? Why did they leave it so late? Why did it continue to employ Monkton Chambers and a QC and 2 barristers? They don't come cheap. How much money was spent on this case, both on government legal fees and on Eurotunnel's fees? So can the Secretary of State say who made the decision to settle with Eurotunnel over the £33 million provision of emergency supplies in the event of a no deal? I will indeed.
Give a very specific answer to that question, Mr. Speaker. A Cabinet Committee.
I'm grateful for that clarification that it took a Cabinet Committee to make such a mess of things. But can he specifically say what's in this standard settlement, or there are clauses within it? Because ordinarily, when these cases are settled, it would be done by reference to a consent order. And in that consent order, there'd be a paragraph dealing with the sum of money to be paid. And in these circumstances, it may say £33 million. And it may say the date upon which that sum is to be paid. And it may say that the costs are to follow the event. So we want to know about the answers to those questions. I will give away.
Does the right honourable gentleman agree with me that it would be highly unusual in an out-of-court settlement for the party settling to stipulate how the party receiving the settlement would actually spend the money? Highly unusual. Does he agree with me on that?
I absolutely agree with that. Having been in practice for the thick end of 30 years, I've never entered into a settlement where the defendant has told me what I'm going to spend the money on. It's absolutely ludicrous. So we need to know. So, happy to.
Earlier, the right honourable gentleman said that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, was being used as a human shield. Is he aware that many of us on these benches have considerable sympathy with the Secretary of State? We believe that he was urging his colleagues for the last 2 years to make contingency planning for no deal, and he was frustrated by other people, perhaps in the Cabinet, who didn't want to do so. And if mistakes are being made because these decisions have been taken at the last moment, it's not the fault of my right honourable friend, but he's too much of a gentleman to actually argue this in his own defence.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman's intervention. It's quite revealing, and I'm grateful to him for that clarification about the obvious chaos that this government is in over these very, very important issues, and do not speak with a concerted and singular voice, and people are falling out with each other left, right and centre. It comes as no surprise to me whatsoever. But I will give way. Yeah.
To the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and he's clearly got a lot more experience in matters of collective responsibility than I have. But taking the previous intervention at its word, is it not the case that if a Secretary of State is clear that the collective responsibility of government is preventing him or her from doing the job properly, the only honourable course of action for that Secretary of State is to resign? So what in fact his friend has done by speaking in his defence is to say that he shouldn't resign now, he should have resigned months ago. Yeah.
It's a fair observation. I don't know whether we've got on the one hand that he was prevented from making contingency planning in the first place because of disputes in the government, and it took the government as a collective decision because nobody could come forward and make a decision on this settlement themselves. That really does characterise a government in absolute chaos and meltdown. But can he say which departments contributed to the £33 million? The Health Secretary yesterday didn't know if his department had contributed. So can he please clarify which department or departments paid this bill? Saying that... and then I must crack on.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. While I don't agree with the action that Eurotunnel took, it has to be said that this £33 million is clearly being invested in border infrastructure, similar investment I would like to see and have been calling for in Dover. Does it not occur to him that actually this money could be being very well spent as no regret spending to improve our borders, border security and trading links?
Well, I'll just say gently to the honourable member That's a ridiculous proposition. If you're saying for one single second that this is wise investment, it takes a court case for people to come to the right conclusion about investing in our border provision. Is he really suggesting that's the way to drive public policy, government policy, through the litigation process, where a claimant gets forward, puts a case to the government and says, this is what you should be doing? He cannot possibly sustain that as an argument. I know he wants to get to his feet and retract that comment, but I'm quite happy to intervene and let him intervene again.
Was making a facile point. My point is very simply that the Secretary of State, confronted with opportunism, has made the best of a bad job to make sure that the investment is invested to the good of the country, not to fatten the profits of Eurotunnel. I think, within the circumstances, he has done the right thing in a very difficult situation while trying to act in the national interest, while being consistently undermined by the Labour Party, the Scots National Party, the Tiggers and everyone opposite, who have been continually trying to undermine this country leaving the European Union.
Well, if the honourable gentleman really thinks that expending £33 million when you didn't want to or need to is a sensible way forward, is a sign of success, I really don't want to see what failure looks like, because that's outrageous. Very well said. So saying that the £33 million was the maximum to be paid implies that a payment was conditional on particular outcomes being achieved. There is a lack of clarity on whether the government can claw back money from Eurotunnel if it's not used on Brexit preparations. So do such provisions exist? And on that point, Mr Speaker, the Permanent Secretary at the DfT, was she correct in saying of the Seaborne Contract Award that I am confident that our process was lawful? And obviously the Department and I acted on legal advice in determining how to take that process forward. So that being so, has his department therefore thrown £33 million of public money down the drain by not contesting Eurotunnel in the courts? Yes. Or is it the case, Mr Speaker, that because of the Prime Minister's catastrophic Brexit negotiating tactics, which have brought us right up to the cliff edge, with 24 days to go before we leave with the default no-deal Brexit, the government's failure to plan for such a devastating outcome has meant they've given themselves no option but to pay out this money to Eurotunnel in these circumstances? Surely nothing says more about the shameful and destructive Conservative Party than how in the year 2019 a government is having to make such costly decisions about prioritising medicines over food supplies. This disaster is only of their own making. The Health Secretary was wrong to claim the urgent question yesterday was not related to Seaborne, even though the legal action was brought about in response to the award of the contract to Seaborne Freight. If it wasn't related, as the Secretary of State for Health stated, he did not explain why an agreement was reached with Eurotunnel now rather than in November or December. It's one way or the other. I'm happy to intervene, and hopefully the Health Secretary can come to the dispatch box and correct his Human Shield colleague that it was directly related to the Seaborne contract. Happy to give way.
Once again, the honourable gentleman has conveniently forgotten that 90% of these contracts, the things on which the NHS is depending, are with DFDS and Brittany Ferries. And I wish he would, at some point, actually be frank with the House and explain the full gamut of what we're talking about.
Mr Speaker, that's not the first time that the Secretary of State has put up this false argument, as if 10% of goods flowing into this country through these ports and by this method are somehow irrelevant and unimportant. It's a ludicrous proposition. If you had damage caused to 10% of the trade coming in, we'd be in an absolutely difficult position. So now I've already let him intervene on the point. Well, come on then, get it over with.
Can't add up. This contract brought 8% of the equivalent in total with DFDS and Brittany Ferries, and the contingency buffer was made up by Seaborne on the basis of buying tickets in advance, which we didn't pay for unless the ship sailed.
Mr Speaker, I can't add up. Pot calling kettle, I really think, on this one. This Secretary of State hasn't been able to count for years. He's costing us a fortune. And Andrew Dean from the law firm Clifford Chance warns this may not be the end of the matter. Mr Dean, who used to advise the DfT and is a procurement specialist, says it's quite likely that the Eurotunnel deal will be challenged. What contingency planning has been done in relation to such a challenge, and what public funds, if any, have been allocated as part of such plans? He talks about that he's been receiving legal advice and he listens to it. Perhaps he could tell the House what advice he's received about the risk of yet further satellite litigation because of this very deal that he's done. And the government talks about the UK maritime industry being market-led. Isn't it the case that his blundering interventions have directly undermined the industry? He promised to ensure continuity of supply in the event of a no-deal Brexit for 6 months. Key to this was not increasing traffic around Dover, yet the Eurotunnel Getlink route is still through the same bottleneck road network on either side of the Channel. The Secretary of State appears to be puzzled by the anger of the House. Allow me to explain why honourable members and the public are so furious. Yes. The latest fiasco would have been enough to warrant the resignation of the Secretary of State, even if it were an isolated incident. But it's not a one-off. Rather, it's the latest costly error in a series of blunders. Blunders that could have been avoided were a different, more competent Secretary of State in post. Mr. Speaker, I will.
Point there, but what my constituents are also very cross about is the sheer waste of money in all of this as well, at a time when we're told that we don't have any money for anything else.
Well, the Right Honourable Member makes a very valid point, and an awful lot of people are looking at these eye-watering sums and thinking what else could be benefited from such interventions. And of course that really just makes my point for me, that the record of this Transport Secretary is that of a departmental wrecking ball. Almost every decision he's made as Secretary of State for Justice was damaging and eventually reversed at significant cost to the taxpayer. As Transport Secretary, he's repeatedly thrown our transport networks into chaos, wasting obscene amounts of public money. A £2 billion bailout for Virgin Trains on the East Coast, his failure to prepare airports for drone attacks, awarding contracts to Carillion when the company was on the verge of collapse, the rail timetabling chaos, the privatisation of probation services, banning books from prisons. The list goes on and on. Research into the total cost of the Secretary of State's mistakes, both in his current role and at the Department for Justice, found that he's cost the taxpayer £2.7 billion. That money could have paid for the annual salaries of 118,000 nurses, 94,000 secondary school teachers. Instead, it's been squandered. He's even wasted more money than the Prime Minister's offered as a Brexit bribe to towns. Shamefully, this has been allowed by the Prime Minister, who keeps him in post because he is short of allies in the Cabinet. The country is being made to pay a heavy price for her political weakness. This would be unacceptable at any time, but is especially... the Right Honourable Gentleman from a Senate position says this is really poor. I really agree with him. This is really, really poor. This would be unacceptable at any time, but is... I'll give it up for that after I finish this point. But it's especially outrageous following years of austerity and neglect that have left our towns and communities hollowed out and our public services in crisis. I'll give way.
To him for giving way. I think he's giving an excellent speech, if I may say so. Does he agree with me that if the SNP government in Edinburgh or the Labour government in Cardiff was guilty of this sort of profligacy with public money, we'd never hear the end of it from the benches opposite?
I think that's exactly right. It's one rule for one, another for the Tory party. No, it isn't a funny issue. Honourable and right honourable members opposite would be condemning of such waste, and with some justification. They really can't complain when other people hold them to account for their continuous errors and wastefulness. Mr. Speaker, there are now 8 million working-age adults in poverty, while child poverty has grown to over 4 million and rising. Councils have had their funding slashed by half. Violent crime is rising and school budgets are seeing cuts for the first time in 20 years. And in my constituency, and many others across the country, there is appalling poverty and people are struggling. We are told that there isn't the money to properly fund our schools, hospitals or social care. Yet the Prime Minister always finds the money to indulge the Transport Secretary's latest blunder. And when it comes to planning for a damaging no deal, a further £1.9 billion has been spent. For some, it seems austerity is over. It is one rule for Tory ministers and another rule for the rest of us. This cannot be allowed to continue. And on behalf of the country, I implore the Secretary of State to resign.
Charlie Elvick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start by congratulating the honourable member, the member for Kilmarnock and Ladoon, for securing this debate. He has been far more efficient and effective than the official opposition, who did not seek this opportunity. It seems to me, representing one of the Channel ports as I do, that we have an issue that the people of Britain voted to leave the European Union. 17.5 million people voted to leave, and we need to make a success of it. And they voted to leave because they believed in Britain, they believed in the kind of land of opportunity that we could build, they believed in the kind of future that we could make outside the European Union. And that vote needs to be respected. And having had that vote, myself having backed Remain, I listened to my constituents who said, let's leave, and I spent the time on contingency planning, setting out a detailed report 2 years ago now about how we need to be ready on day one, deal or no deal, and how we could overhaul our entire customs systems, how we could overhaul our road infrastructure, how we could overhaul our border infrastructure, and how that investment was no regret spending, because a more efficient border system will actually provide economic growth. Not my case, but a more efficient border system will provide more economic growth. So said John Thompson, the head of HMRC, in evidence to the Treasury Select Committee when I raised the possibility of a single Department of Borders with him. And that's why I say this is no regrets spending, to invest in our borders, to invest in our border security, to invest in our border systems. The Shadow Secretary of State rejects that view and says it's an absurd view that we should make such investment. And no doubt such investment would not be made under a Labour government. They didn't make it last time. They wouldn't do it again. They're not serious about border security, and they have a leader who believes that every single migrant should be allowed to wander into the country. I give way.
To him for giving way. I think if he wants to just recite what I said accurately, I said it was a peculiar way of going about investing in infrastructure by the litigation route. Surely, to goodness, that is not the way we go about business when we're developing policy in this country. We don't wait for somebody to sue us to decide what we're going to do.
Absolutely right. But it failed to invest completely in many things, including border infrastructure, when they were last in power. And they have not been serious about border security and border control ever since. Give way.
Thank you. Thank my honourable friend for giving way. Did he note, as I did, that under the stewardship of the last Labour government, the UK transport system fell from 7th best in the world to 33rd? And perhaps that's an indication of how well they would look after a transport system again in the future, should they get an opportunity, which I hope they don't.
And my own friend is absolutely right. This government has been investing substantially in transport, and I believe we need to have more investment in roads to the ports, as set out in transport reports before now, and infrastructure investment at our ports, because it is so important, particularly as we leave the European Union, that we invest in our trading systems, that we ensure that the ferry systems, the channel tunnel systems, all our logistics systems work efficiently, swiftly and well. And that's why I set out 2 years ago that we needed to plan, that we needed to be ready on day one, deal or no deal. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank him for giving way. First of all, I welcome the fact that congratulate him in securing this debate. That would suggest he agrees there's a need for an emergency debate because the government has not answered questions properly. He's making a point about contingency planning, and I respect he's talking about planning ahead, and he's talking about 2 years ago. He's talking about no regret spending. Does he know more than any of us here what security improvements are coming with the £33 million settlement from Eurotunnel? Because certainly the Transport Secretary hasn't explained that.
Thank the honourable gentleman for that. I don't represent the tunnel which is in Folkestone and Hythe. I represent the constituency of Dover. But I have been keen to press the Secretary of State to make sure that Dover has similar investment and that Dover doesn't lose out from that investment, and I look forward to having a confirmation from the Secretary of State that that will be the case. Now, let's just scroll forward.
My honourable friend, allow me.
Yes, of course.
We all know that, away from the party games, the problems facing the British transport system are so intractable that who was ever Secretary of State will be facing many of these problems. But does my honourable friend also accept that many of us on these benches think that if the rest of the Cabinet had listened to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, 2 years ago, and we'd started no-deal planning then, not only would we have got a much better deal offered by the EU because they would have taken us seriously, but we wouldn't have made the mistakes that clearly have been made. It's not his fault.
In fact, my honourable friend for saying that, and that is exactly the point that I'm coming to. I set out how we needed to invest to be ready on day one, deal or no deal. And the reason was, as I argued at the time, that in order to get the best negotiation, you need to be able to get up and walk away from the table. I also set out detailed legal reasons why it was we didn't owe any money in the divorce bill. Again, important to our negotiation. The government as a whole, the Cabinet, decided not to spend money at that time. The Cabinet decided not to invest at that time. The Cabinet decided not to take forward contingency planning until a substantial level until after the Chequers discussions. To visit that on this Secretary of State
Absolutely right.
would not be fair, right or proper. This Secretary of State, I've given away quite a lot, let me make some progress. This Secretary of State has worked hard in the national interest to make sure that once authorised, contingency plans have been taken forward. Now, I've pressed him on this. I myself wanted to see a new route from Dover to Zeebrugge in Belgium. But that would require a level of intervention that is actually difficult under the procurement rules. And as it was, the Secretary of State took procedures which were known to be legally risky within the department, but because of the amount of time available, were seen as in the national interest. And I have to say they are in the national interest. It was in the national interest to do that. Now, I think it could have been very easy for the Port of Dover to opportunistically gone for a legal action as to how they were shut out of this, but actually that would not have been the right thing to do, because everyone could see across the country what the Secretary of State was trying to achieve. What the Secretary was trying to do was to take pressure off the Port of Dover and the Channel Tunnel in the case there were difficulties with France, which at the time was a concern from the kind of rhetoric that was coming out of the French President, Monsieur Macron. That said, because now things have moved on, we now know that the European Union is going to extend transit on a no-deal basis, so the risk now is actually much less than it was. But at the time, that was not known. And it is right that the Secretary of State takes the measures on the information before him, that the Department takes the measures on the information before them. And that's, yes, of course.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I'm listening to his speech with quite some interest. Would he agree with me that actually if there's a choice between running a risk with a potential legal action or running a risk with no medicines in our NHS, would he make the same choice as the Secretary of State did?
And therein lies the heart of what this debate is really about. The opposition is saying the Secretary of State should not have taken this action at all. The opposition are attacking him for taking contingency planning measures. If you look at the heart of what the kernel of the opposition argument is that the Secretary of State was wrong to take these kind of measures to plan and take contingency planning. And I think that that is incredibly opportunistic. And I think the Secretary of State, as I said, may not have been allowed to be out of the traps as early as many of us on this House would have liked, but once away, he took the steps, took the measures that were necessary. Now, I do think there are some important things that need to be done to improve in our country away from the whole issue of contingency planning. The reason we're having to do contingency planning is because we haven't invested in our border systems and border infrastructure as perhaps we might have done in the past. And I would just set out the case for my constituency and for the people of Kent that actually we do need to make sure that we are better prepared on infrastructure. Irrespective of Brexit, we end up with big queues in Kent. We end up with problems on the ferries, problems in the tunnel, which is partly down to infrastructure. And that's why contingency planning and also no contingency planning, there does need to be investment in more lorry parking in Kent. And the Department of Transport needs to be more effective in taking that forward. There does need to be upgrades of the roads to the port, particularly the dualling of the A2, which is long overdue and was taken out of the programme by John Prescott back in 1997. One of those cuts of the early Labour government back in the day needs to be brought back into the programme absolutely as quickly as possible. Then the contingency plans need to be made so that they work on a balanced basis between the tunnel and the Port of Dover. That too is incredibly important. I give way.
For giving way. Does he not accept that the case being made is not that there should not be contingency planning, but if the contingency planning had been done in a timely fashion under proper procurement rules, it would not have put the legal risk, which has now cost the government at least £33 million.
The difficulty with her with that point is she and her party are trying to lay that blame opportunistically at the Secretary of State's door. My point is the government as a whole should have released the funds, made the decision to invest in our borders, and we should, and irrespective of this debate, and irrespective of Brexit, it is something that it is in the national interest to do, because more efficient, effective, safe, secure borders and more efficient trading systems is something our country will benefit from, but less people being able to enter the country unlawfully, to make sure that people who are in the country unlawfully can be helped back to where they have come, and also to make sure that trading systems are efficient and effective, not just for the trade we do with Europe, but also for the trade we do under WTO terms already. The more efficient we make our trading systems, the more you get economic growth. And again, that's not just my words, that is what John Thompson has been saying in evidence to the Treasury Select Committee, and he runs HMRC. I'll give way one last time.
Thank you for giving way. Given that his robust defence of Transport Secretary saying he was not at fault, but it's the entire government that's at fault, who does he think should be resigning over this fiasco?
I'm saying the Secretary of State is not at fault, but actually it is not members of this government who are at fault. It is too many members of this House of Commons who are at fault for not heeding the votes of 17.4 million people who said we should leave the European Union, and we should leave the European Union at the end of March. It is about carrying into effect the referendum mandate, which the party opposite, the Scottish National Party, has continually declined to do and sought to stop at every single turn. And the party opposite, the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrat Party and the Tiggers, have sought to stop at every turn. And what this House should do, this House should respect the decision of the British people, because this House asked the British people to make that decision, and having asked the British people to make that decision having been made, it should be respected. And it is people in this House who are at fault, who they know who they are, and they meant to sit to a person on the party on the benches opposite. They know that they have not been doing their bit to ensure we carry into effect the democratic will and the democratic decision of the British people. But as for trying to attack this Secretary of State in an opportunistic way, I have to say it is entirely shameful of the parties opposite who have sought to do that, when the whole House knows that the Secretary of State has been working hard and doing his bit in the national interest to make sure that Brexit is a success and make sure that we are ready on day one at the end of March.
Well said.
Carol Monaghan.
Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for securing this important debate. It's interesting, following the honourable member for Dover, who asks us to respect the decision of the people. Well, here in these benches, we respect the decision of our constituents and the people of Scotland, who voted 62% to remain, and we will continue not just to respect that, but stand here and defend their decision. He also speaks about this utopia that people voted for, those who voted Leave voted for. He talked about this wonderful place that would be the UK out of Europe. What he failed to state or failed to recognise, that actually people were voting that because they were neglected, they were forgotten, they were ignored. For years and years, these areas had not been invested in. And as a result, yes, there was a vote, and it was a vote of anger and it was a vote of protest. It wasn't a vote for the mess we currently have. Yesterday, during the urgent question on the Eurotunnel payment, the Secretary of State for Health insisted 24 times, and I've been through Hansard, 24 times he insisted that these contracts were about the unhindered supply of medicines. Now, He also went on to say, "I find it astonishing that members on the opposition benches continue to make the case that this is not about medicines. It is all about medicines." Now, I just wonder, if it's all about medicines, what part of the contingency planning awards contracts when it's all about the medicines and the vital supply to a company that has no ferries? It makes no sense whatsoever. But since yesterday, the Secretary of State for Health answered questions for his pal, the Secretary of State for Transport, I'm assuming we've got a reciprocal agreement going on today. So today I'm hoping that the Secretary of State for Transport can answer, before he leaves, can answer some questions about health. Because if this is all about the unhindered supply of medicines, we need the Secretary of State to answer some questions on medicines. In particular, I want him to answer questions about medical radioisotopes. Now, I've been asking about this for over 2 years now, without any proper information coming forward. I asked yesterday, but I'd previously asked a fortnight ago on the 19th of February during health questions. And since the Health Secretary isn't here today, it's a shame not to see him here today since he's so good in transport. But since he isn't here, on the 19th of February, he said any issues with the supply, any issues that are, with the supply of radioisotopes would be dealt with, because the radioisotopes would then be brought in by air, and this planning was at an advanced stage. So that, I felt, was a really useful statement. And if this contingency planning is indeed at an advanced stage, I'd be keen to hear about the arrangements. I'd be keen to know what actually is happening to ensure that we can continue to have radioisotopes for medical diagnosis and cancer treatments. Now, currently, most of our medical isotopes come either through Calais or they come through Coventry Airport. Now, assuming that in the event of problems in Calais or in Dover, they're going to be coming in to Coventry, we can assume that there's expertise there to deal with it, and we know that currently they deal with them very efficiently and effectively. But if we increase the capacity, has there been increased capacity planning? We know that we've now got 33 million, and we've had statements today it's going to be to improve the services and to make sure everything runs smoothly. We've heard it all, but I'm wondering how much has been spent in Coventry Airport for increasing the capacity there. And if we are at an advanced stage of planning, I wonder how much training and upskilling has been done for staff there in Coventry, because dealing with radioisotopes does need special skills and does need special training. But I'm sure it's fine because we're at an advanced stage. The UK is not self-sufficient in producing these materials. Now, most of the materials we get, around 80% of them, come from Europe, from the Netherlands, Belgium and France. But unlike medicines, these cannot be stockpiled. As soon as they are produced, they begin to decay. And the longer the delay, the smaller the dose of useful isotope remains. Now, we have two isotopes that are important in this process. We've got molybdenum, that has a half-life of 66 hours. Now, just to be clear, a half-life means that after 66 hours, it's half as effective as it was. After another 66 hours, it's half as effective again. So if we've got a delay of even under a week, we only get a quarter of the useful substance getting to us. Now, once we get the molybdenum, we then use it to generate technetium, which is an even shorter half-life, a half-life of only 6 hours. That has to get to patients quickly, or it is utterly unusable. Now, not only does that have implications for their health, it also has cost implications. If the original molybdenum is not got to us quickly, we've only got half of the stuff or a quarter of the stuff there that we thought we could use. It's problematic. Now, in 2008, a Channel Tunnel fire interrupted the supply of medical radioisotopes from the continent. Even this brief disturbance affected services. In 2015, industrial action in Calais resulted in radioisotopes being flown in, again via Coventry Airport. Now, the concern is that what we are facing currently is far greater than any of these incidents and much harder to mitigate against. And the duration of the disruption is almost impossible to predict. So there are major questions over the UK's ability to safeguard measures such as air freight deliveries of these radioisotopes. Assuming the aviation is completely unaffected by Brexit, there will be additional costs, and there's no guarantee that the supplies will be smooth, predictable and uninterrupted. There is uncertainty over the sourcing of radioisotopes from the European Union. Currently, we're part of Euratom, and through that we are able to source these. Yes, of course, we can go further afield. We can go to Canada. Can't go to South Africa anymore because they've shut their reactor down. So there's even more, the supplies are even more limited than before. Could go to Canada, but then you've got the time factor again, which, as I've already explained, makes that problematic. So there are serious implications here. But radioisotopes represent just one fragile and time-sensitive supply chain. But the challenges are considerable. With multiple links in the supply chain simultaneously threatened, as we're seeing just now, the potential for serious disruption is immense. The costs could be substantial, not least to the 1 million UK patients who depend on these services every single year. But I'm sure the emergency planning has taken that into account. So I'd like to hear, it's a pity the Secretary of State for Transport is gone, because I would like to hear some stuff about both about the contingency planning for getting these medicines to the UK. But also, since we're able to switch roles, I would also like to hear more about how he's sourcing these medicines. I want to know about the spending, what spending has taken place in Coventry. But finally, I want to thank the Secretary of State for Transport for agreeing to appear here today. It was nice he was here for a bit. So, I look forward to hearing more about this unhindered supply of medicines.
Thank you. Yes, the honourable gentleman didn't actually put in to speak. We may have bobbed. He didn't. I've just told him. Sit down. The honourable gentleman didn't put in to speak. He's signalling he wishes to speak, and that's... leave me to make the judgment and tell him what the situation is. He'll benefit from the instruction that I'm about to give him. I'm working on the basis of an informal time limit, and it would be helpful if colleagues did not exceed 12 minutes each. Mr Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for that guidance. I will, of course, observe that courtesy. I wouldn't wish to prevent other members having the opportunity to contribute to this debate. But I must say it's interesting to follow the member for Glasgow North West, in particular interesting Coventry Airport. As a former deputy leader of Coventry City Council myself, one of the issues with that airport is it's actually quite an underutilised resource. Since a couple of years back, the passenger flights were ended from it, sadly, in a quite sad decision that was made by the then Labour government not to allow them permission for a terminal that would have allowed it to become a sustainable, financially sustainable service. So helpfully there is quite a large resource there and an ability to develop it further, and I hope that helps give her some reassurances. And certainly it's an airport that I think could contribute a lot more in the future to our economy more generally, although of course now I focus my remarks more in relation to Torbay. But I do have a general feeling of a bit of a Groundhog Day in terms of this debate. Those who normally come here to tell us how dreadful no deal will be, to raise some legitimate concerns about that, what that may mean and what that might mean for business and economies, then normally the next day pop back to complain about measures to mitigate against no deal. And there is always going to be a need to try and move at some urgency, and particularly in relation to what this contract is actually about. And whilst we keep on talking about the ferries, the actual thing we were talking about yesterday is the fact this is about securing the supply of vital medicines into the UK if there is disruption at the border. And it's also worth noting that this wasn't just a contract to seaborne freight, which is what, of course, is being regularly portrayed for pretty obvious reasons by what they were there. There's also contracts with DFDS and Brittany Ferries, which represent the majority of the capacity that was there. Those contracts are still in place, even though the one with seaborne freight is not. And it is worth saying, as I perhaps alluded to in my intervention on the member for Dover, whose speech I found quite informative and useful, is actually that this is about what balance of debate there is. And let's be candid, if the Secretary of State had refused to take a decision to create additional capacity, we'd probably be here having a debate about the lack of capacity, potential capacity, for medicines to be transported into this country in a no-deal scenario. Instead, we're here having a debate about whether the legal risk was the right to take, which is ultimately what the nub of this debate is. Now, in any scenario, it's not going to be 100% that you can say exactly what any particular legal risk will be. And also, neither is anyone presenting a legal case to court going to start, or particularly any gambits towards reaching an out-of-court settlement, start with the gambit, we think we're done, now we're going to come here and negotiate. That would clearly be an absolutely ludicrous position to adopt at the start of any discussions. And having done discussions myself, you always start with the fact that you're always going to clearly start with the fact you feel your case is strong, as both sides will. You'd be surprised if Euroton had walked in the door and decided that they wouldn't. But I'll briefly give way to Honourable Leonard.
I'm just wondering if, like myself and the Honourable Gentleman who speaks for the official opposition, he has never come across a case where the settlement, in a commercial case, where the settler stipulates how the settlee must spend the money. That is simply unheard of. Will he contradict that?
Thanks, Honourable Learned Lady, for her intervention. And it gives me an opportunity to confirm that this isn't about 33 million quid going straight into Eurotunnel shareholders' pockets. This is about it actually being spent on specified outcomes. So I must say I'm perfectly content to see what is actually being used in the settlement. But let's be clear. And I'll continue my speech for a few moments. In terms of actually where we are, this isn't about just handing over 33 million quid in terms of it. It is about the fact that there is an investment that will follow with a company that, let's be blunt, the government works very closely with on a range of issues. And I'd also say, let's be blunt, if there was disruptions at the border, we'd be here immediately with the opposition having a go, complaining about it, and now here we are today complaining about measures to try and mitigate disruption if there was a no-deal outcome. So for me, it is that balance of what the Secretary of State would have had to look at, the legal risk versus the risk of no medicines coming in to the NHS. And that is the nub of making a decision. If every decision ever went perfectly, then there would never be a debate in this chamber about that. But this is where it fundamentally boils down to. Now, if the Shadow Secretary of State, who's chuntering from a sedentary position, says he would have taken the view that actually I won't award those contracts, I'll take the risk on medicines in terms of supply, in terms of no deal, that's a position, it's one he could defend. I must say it's not, I think, the right decision. My personal view would be better to take more of a legal risk than it is to take a risk with vital life-saving medicines. But again, it's one that he can try and defend if he wishes to. I'll briefly give way.
I thank him for giving way. I mean, on that, and he was arguing that this 33 million will not be going directly to Eurotunnel shareholders because of these improved services and border systems and security. Can he clarify, given the Transport Secretary, and can he clarify what these additional services are and inform the House, because we would all appreciate that?
For his intervention. I must say, when you're investing in border security, you don't normally put the exact details of what you're doing out there, do you? But I must say it's certainly been covered, and he's had his answers to his points. He may not like the answers he gets, but he's had his answers, and I won't take a further intervention on that. But again, this is what comes back to the nub. Some people come here today talking about the fact that we should take no deal off the table. That would make all this absolutely pointless. Well, I'm afraid you can't just take no deal off the table. You've actually got to do one of two things. To be fair, there is a consistent position from the Scottish National Party, and to be fair, the Liberal Democrats, that they would look to ignore the referendum result by revoking Article 50. In effect, they take it off by staying within the European Union. The only other option to take no deal off the table is to actually agree a deal, to actually agree something with the European Union. And that is where the inconsistency of many of the Labour Party's positions come up. is that it's all very well saying, I don't like this deal, I don't like that deal, I don't want this deal. But actually, at the end of the day, unless you're prepared to actually say that you would revoke Article 50, which, to be fair, there's two parties that stood on that platform, not a platform I agree with, but it's at least a coherent position, then it's absolute nonsense to come in and say, we demand that we don't like any of the deals, but we demand no deals taken off the table. It is absolute tosh and rubbish. Briefly.
I'm very grateful, member, for giving me in that point. Has he read the alternative deal that was put forward by the Scottish Government in December 2016?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. I must say the thing I did read was the white paper that was put out. There was a bit of a work of fiction from the Scottish National Party a few years ago. But my understanding, unless he wants to correct me, my understanding is his position is he wishes to remain within the European Union. That was my understanding. If he's going to get up there and say no, that would be quite a surprise.